Settle in, let your breath slow, and allow yourself to drift into the ancient world of myth, where gods walked among mortals and heroes faced impossible trials. In the shadowed valleys of ancient Greece, where mountain peaks pierce the heavens and the gods look down upon the world of mortals, there begins a story unlike any other. It is the tale of a hero born between two worlds, a man whose very existence challenged the boundaries between mortality and divinity, whose strength could shatter mountains yet whose heart bore the weight of unspeakable tragedy. This is the story of Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, the greatest of all Greek heroes, whose name has echoed through 26 centuries of human memory, and whose deeds have become the very definition of the word Herculean. To understand Heracles, we must first understand the circumstances of his birth, for it is here that the seeds of both his greatness and his suffering were planted. In the city of Thebes, there lived a mortal woman of extraordinary beauty named Alcmene. She was married to Amphitryon, a noble warrior and descendant of the legendary hero Perseus. But Alcmene's beauty had not gone unnoticed by the gods themselves. Zeus, the king of the gods, ruler of Mount Olympus and wielder of the thunderbolt, looked down from his celestial throne and desired her with an intensity that would shape the fate of the world. Zeus was no stranger to mortal affairs. His infidelities were legendary, and they had earned him the eternal enmity of his wife, Hera, the queen of the gods and the goddess of marriage. But his desire for Alcmene was different somehow, perhaps because he saw in their potential offspring the chance to create a bridge between the divine and mortal realms, a champion who could defend humanity against the primordial forces of chaos that still lurked at the edges of the civilized world. The god descended to Thebes, but not in his true form, for that would surely have destroyed the mortal woman. Instead, Zeus took on the appearance of Amphitryon himself, waiting until the true husband was away at war. He extended a single night into the length of 3, commanding Helios, the god of the sun, not to rise so that he might have more time with Alcmene. And in that impossible night, Heracles was conceived. When Amphitryon returned from his campaign, he too lay with his wife, and thus Alcmene bore twins. One was Heracles, son of Zeus, divine in blood and destined for immortality. The other was Iphicles, son of Amphitryon, fully mortal and destined to live his life in the shadow of his extraordinary brother. From the moment of his birth, Heracles was marked by the divine, but he was also marked by something far darker, the hatred of Hera. Hera's rage was not merely the jealousy of a spurned wife, though that was certainly part of it. The very name, Heracles, means glory of Hera, an ironic title given by Zeus himself, perhaps in a futile attempt to placate his wife. But the name only inflamed Hera's fury. Here was living, breathing proof of her husband's infidelity, a child who would grow to become the greatest of heroes, celebrated throughout the Greek world, his name forever linked to the goddess who despised him. When Heracles was still an infant, lying in his crib beside his brother Iphicles, Hera sent 2 enormous serpents to kill the children. The snakes slithered through the darkness of the nursery, their scales gleaming in the moonlight, their fangs dripping with venom capable of killing a grown man with a single drop. They approached the crib where the 2 babies lay sleeping, their mouths opening wide to strike. But something remarkable happened. While Iphicles screamed in terror, alerting the household, the infant Heracles awoke and, without hesitation, grabbed the serpents by their throats, one in each tiny hand. The parents rushed into the room to find their baby boy laughing with delight, strangling the massive snakes with strength that no mortal child could possibly possess. It was the first sign of the extraordinary power that Zeus had gifted to his son. As Heracles grew, his superhuman strength became increasingly evident. He was larger than other children, stronger, faster, more resilient. But he was also, importantly, intelligent and capable of great kindness. His mortal father Amphitryon, recognizing the boy's potential, ensured he received the finest education available. Heracles was trained in music by Linus, a brother of the legendary musician Orpheus. He learned to read and write, to understand poetry and philosophy. From Castor, one of the Dioscuri twins, he learned the art of combat and swordsmanship. Eurytus taught him archery, at which Heracles became so skilled that he could shoot an arrow through a ring tossed in the air. From Amphitryon himself, he learned to drive a chariot, maneuvering the horses with the precision of a master. But perhaps his most important teacher was Chiron, the wise centaur who lived on Mount Pelion. Unlike other centaurs, who were known for their wild and violent nature, Chiron was civilized and learned, famous for teaching many of Greece's greatest heroes. From Chiron, Heracles learned medicine and healing, astronomy and philosophy, and most importantly, the wisdom to temper his enormous strength with compassion and judgment. Chiron taught him that true heroism wasn't just about physical prowess but about using that strength in service of justice and the protection of the innocent. Yet despite this careful education, despite the love of his family, and the guidance of wise teachers, Heracles' strength sometimes got the better of him. In one tragic incident during his youth, his music teacher Linus criticized him harshly for a mistake. Heracles, in a momentary flash of anger, struck Linus with his lyre, killing him instantly. It was not intentional, but it was a harbinger of the tragedy that would define much of Heracles' life, the terrible consequences that could result when his God-given power overwhelmed his human judgment. As Heracles entered manhood, his reputation grew. He became known throughout the region for his strength and courage. When the city of Thebes was threatened by the Minyans, a powerful neighboring people who demanded an oppressive tribute, it was Heracles who stood up against their king, Erginus. He cut off the noses of the Minyan heralds who came to collect the tribute, a deliberate and shocking insult. War was inevitable, but Heracles led the Theban forces to victory, killing King Erginus himself in single combat and freeing Thebes from subjugation. In gratitude, King Creon of Thebes offered Heracles his daughter, Megara, as a bride. It seemed like the beginning of a happy life for the young hero. Heracles and Megara were married, and she bore him children. The ancient sources disagree on the exact number, with some saying 3, others as many as 8, but all agree that Heracles loved them deeply. He was, by all accounts, a devoted father and husband. For a time, it seemed that Heracles might escape the curse of Hera's hatred and live a normal, happy mortal life. But Hera had not forgotten her vendetta. She had merely been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, a moment when Heracles had the most to lose. And when that moment came, she showed no mercy. The exact sequence of events varies depending on which ancient source you consult. In the most traditional version of the myth, Hera struck after Heracles had established his happy family life. In Euripides' powerful tragedy, Heracles, written in the 5th century before the Common Era, the goddess waited until Heracles had completed his famous 12 labors and returned home, expecting to find peace and rest with his loved ones. But in all versions, the result was the same, unimaginable horror. Hera sent Lyssa, the personification of mad rage, to possess Heracles. Lyssa herself reportedly protested, knowing the injustice of what she was being commanded to do, but Hera's command was absolute. The madness descended upon Heracles like a dark fog, warping his perception of reality, and transforming his home into a nightmarish battlefield. In his delusion, Heracles saw enemies where his loved ones stood. He believed he was in the palace of Eurystheus, the king who had set him his labors, surrounded by foes who threatened all he held dear. What happened next is almost too terrible to recount. Heracles took up his bow and arrows, those weapons that had slain so many monsters in service of humanity, and he turned them upon his own children. In some accounts, he shot them with arrows. In others, he threw them into a fire, believing them to be the children of his enemies. His wife Megara, desperate to protect her children, tried to stop him, but in his madness, Heracles saw only Hera herself, or in some versions, the wife of Eurystheus. He killed her too. The massacre continued until Athena, the goddess of wisdom who had always favored Heracles, intervened. She could not stop Hera's curse directly, but she could end its immediate effects. Athena threw a stone that struck Heracles in the chest, knocking him unconscious before he could kill anyone else. In some versions, before he could kill his mortal father Amphitryon, who was frantically trying to stop him. When Heracles awoke, the madness had lifted. He found himself in his own home, surrounded by the bodies of his wife and children, their blood on his hands, his arrows scattered around him. The horror of what he had done, even though he had no conscious will in the act, was overwhelming. This was a man who had used his incredible strength to protect others, to fight monsters, to defend the innocent. And now that same strength had been turned against those he loved most in the world. In his despair, Heracles attempted to take his own life. It was his friend Theseus, another great hero of Greek mythology, who stopped him. Theseus argued that suicide would be the coward's way out, that Heracles owed it to the memory of his family to live and atone for what had happened, even though it wasn't truly his fault. The gods had done this to him, yes, but the deed was still done, and only Heracles could make it right. Seeking guidance and purification, Heracles traveled to the Oracle of Delphi, the sacred site where the god Apollo spoke through his priestess, the Pythia. He prostrated himself before the oracle, begging to know how he could atone for his horrific crime. The oracle's response would change his life forever and set him on a path that would make him immortal. The Pythia told him he must go to Tiryns and place himself in the service of King Eurystheus, his cousin, for 12 years. Whatever tasks Eurystheus set for him, Heracles must complete them without question. Only through this servitude could he purify himself of the blood guilt that now stained his hands. This command was particularly bitter for Heracles to swallow. Eurystheus was not just his cousin, he was the man who should never have been king at all. You see, both Heracles and Eurystheus were descendants of Perseus, another son of Zeus. By rights, Heracles, as the son of Zeus himself and the stronger of the two, should have ruled Mycenae and Tiryns. But Hera had manipulated his birth so that Eurystheus would be born first and thus inherit the throne. So now Heracles, the greatest hero in all of Greece, would have to bow before a lesser man, a coward who was too weak to accomplish the tasks he would set, and serve him like a common slave. But Heracles had no choice. The oracle had spoken, and to refuse would be to refuse the will of the gods themselves. Moreover, the oracle promised him something extraordinary. If he successfully completed his service to Eurystheus, he would not only be cleansed of his sin, but he would be granted immortality. He would ascend to Mount Olympus and take his place among the gods themselves. And so Heracles journeyed to Tiryns, his heart heavy with grief, his soul burdened with guilt, but his resolve unshakable. He presented himself to Eurystheus, and announced he was ready to serve. Eurystheus, advised by Hera herself, decided to set Heracles 10 labors, 10 tasks that he believed would be impossible for even this mighty hero to complete. They would be designed to test not just Heracles' legendary strength but also his courage, his intelligence, his perseverance, and his willingness to face death itself. Little did Eurystheus know that these labors would transform Heracles from a tragic figure into the greatest hero of the ancient world. Each task would strip away another piece of his mortality, forging him through suffering and triumph into something more than human. The 12 labors of Heracles were about to begin, and the world would never be the same. The first task that Eurystheus set before Heracles was deceptively simple: kill the Nemean lion and bring back its hide. But there was nothing simple about this beast. The Nemean lion was no ordinary predator. It was a monster descended from the most terrible creatures in all of Greek mythology. According to most accounts, it was the offspring of Typhon, the 100-headed giant who had nearly overthrown Zeus himself, and Echidna, the mother of monsters. Some sources even claimed the lion had fallen from the moon, sent by Hera specifically to plague humanity. The creature terrorized the region of Nemea, a valley in the northeastern Peloponnese. It had made its lair in a cave with 2 entrances, and from there it would emerge to hunt. But this was no normal hunting. The lion didn't simply kill for food. It seemed to take sadistic pleasure in terrorizing the population, It would snatch women and hold them captive in its cave, using them as bait to lure brave men who would try to rescue them. When the would-be rescuers arrived, the lion would tear them apart. What made the Nemean lion truly fearsome, what elevated it from a mere large predator to a monster worthy of legend, was its hide. The lion's skin was completely impervious to weapons. No sword could cut it, no spear could pierce it, no arrow could penetrate it. Men had tried, brave warriors had tested their blades against the beast, and all had died. The lion seemed invincible, and the people of Nemea lived in constant terror, never knowing when the beast would strike next. Eurystheus knew all this when he assigned the task to Heracles. He believed it would be the hero's death. After all, Heracles was famous for his strength and his skill with the bow and arrow, gifts from the gods themselves. Apollo had given him a magnificent bow, and Heracles' arrows, which he had learned to make and use from the master archer Eurytus, were said to never miss their mark. But what good would arrows be against a creature whose hide could not be pierced? Eurystheus was certain that Heracles would die in Nemea, torn apart by the invincible lion, and Hera would finally have her revenge. But Eurystheus and Hera had underestimated both Heracles' intelligence and his determination. Heracles set out for Nemea without hesitation, traveling through the mountains and valleys that led to the lion's territory. As he approached the valley, he began to see the signs of the beast's presence: abandoned farms, ruined buildings, and the occasional human bones scattered along the path. The land itself seemed to hold its breath in fear. Heracles spent several days tracking the lion, studying its habits and patterns. He was not just a warrior, he was a hunter, trained by some of the greatest teachers in Greece. He learned where the lion preferred to hunt, where it liked to rest, and most importantly, the location of its cave. He noted that the cave had two entrances, one at either end of a rocky passage. The lion clearly used this to its advantage. If anyone tried to corner it by entering through one opening, it could simply escape through the other. Armed with this knowledge, Heracles decided on a plan. He would not rely solely on his weapons, he would rely on his mind. One night, when the moon was dark and the lion had gone out to hunt, Heracles approached the cave and used massive boulders to seal off one of the two entrances. Now the lion had only one way in or out of its lair. It was a trap, and Heracles was the bait. When the lion returned before dawn, its massive form silhouetted against the gray morning sky, Heracles was waiting. He stood at the cave entrance with his bow drawn, his arrows nocked. As the lion approached, Heracles let fly with his arrows, one after another, each shot perfect, each finding its mark on the lion's body. But just as he had feared, the arrows bounced off the beast's impenetrable hide, falling uselessly to the ground like twigs striking stone. The lion, now aware that it was being attacked and furious at the affront, let out a roar that shook the very mountains. The sound was like thunder, filled with rage and power, and it would have frozen any normal man in terror. But Heracles had faced the madness sent by Hera herself. He had looked into the abyss of his own guilt and despair. A lion's roar, no matter how terrifying, could not break his resolve. Seeing that his arrows were useless, Heracles cast aside his bow and drew his sword, a gift from Hermes himself. He charged at the lion, meeting its attack head-on. The blade rang against the lion's hide but could not cut it. He tried his bronze club, a massive weapon that could shatter stone, bringing it down on the lion's skull with all his divine strength. The club broke in half against the beast's unbreakable bones. Now Heracles understood the full truth of his situation. He could not kill this creature with any weapon forged by mortal or divine hands. If he was to defeat the Nemean lion, he would have to rely on the one weapon that no one else possessed, his own God-given strength. He would have to use his bare hands. The lion, sensing that its prey had been disarmed, leaped at Heracles with its claws extended and its jaws wide, ready to tear him apart as it had torn apart so many others. But Heracles was ready. As the massive beast flew through the air toward him, Heracles stepped into the attack, wrapping his enormously powerful arms around the lion's neck. The two crashed to the ground in a tangle of muscle and fur, and the lion realized too late that it had met something it had never encountered before, a creature as strong as itself. What followed was a brutal struggle that lasted for what seemed like hours. The lion thrashed and clawed, trying to break free from Heracles' grip. Its claws, which could tear through armor like parchment, raked across Heracles' skin, drawing blood. Its powerful jaws snapped at his face, close enough that Heracles could feel the beast's hot breath and smelled the decay of old kills. But Heracles only tightened his grip, using all the strength that Zeus had given him, channeling all the rage and frustration of his tragic past into his arms. Slowly, inexorably, Heracles squeezed. The lion's roars became gurgles, its thrashing became weaker. The beast's eyes, which had gleamed with such malevolent intelligence, began to dim. And finally, with one last spasm, the Nemean lion went limp in Heracles' arms. The invincible monster was dead, strangled by the only force strong enough to kill it, the hands of a god's son. Heracles stood, breathing heavily, covered in blood both his own and the lion's, and looked down at the massive corpse. The first labor was complete, but now he faced a new problem. Eurystheus had commanded him to bring back the lion's hide, but how could he skin a creature whose hide could not be cut by any blade? Heracles tried his sword again, and again it failed to pierce the skin. He tried sharpening the edge on stones, but the result was the same. The hide remained impenetrable. It was then that Athena, the goddess of wisdom who had always favored Heracles and who had intervened to stop his madness, appeared before him. She did not speak, but she gestured toward the lion's own claws. And in that moment, Heracles understood. The only thing that could cut the Nemean lion's hide was the Nemean lion itself. He severed one of the beast's razor-sharp claws and used it to carefully cut the pelt from the body. The process took hours, but when it was done, Heracles had the lion's entire hide, complete with the head that he could wear as a hood. He fashioned it into a cloak, draping the massive pelt over his shoulders with the lion's head resting atop his own like a helmet. The hide that had been impervious to every weapon ever made would now serve as Heracles' armor, protecting him from harm in the many battles to come. It would become his most iconic attribute, the symbol by which he would be recognized throughout the ancient world and for all time. When Heracles returned to Tiryns with the lion's pelt, carrying it on his shoulders and wearing it like the trophy it was, Eurystheus was terrified. The king had expected to hear news of Heracles' death, not to see him return victorious with proof of the impossible kill. In some accounts, Eurystheus was so frightened by the sight of the hero in the lion's skin that he hid in a large bronze jar that had been sunk into the ground, refusing to come out. From this safe distance, he screamed that Heracles must never again enter the city walls. From now on, he must display the proof of his labors outside the gates, and Eurystheus would send a herald to inspect them. But more than Eurystheus' fear, what mattered was what the first labor revealed about Heracles himself. Yes, he had tremendous physical strength, enough to strangle a monster with his bare hands. But he also had intelligence, patience, and the ability to adapt. When his weapons failed, he didn't give up, he changed tactics. When he couldn't skin the lion with conventional tools, he figured out an unconventional solution. This combination of brawn and brains, of power and wisdom, would be what truly made him the greatest of heroes. The first labor also established a pattern that would repeat throughout all the tasks to come. Heracles was facing more than just monsters. He was facing the very forces of primordial chaos that the Olympian gods had fought to tame when they established their rule. The Nemean lion, descended from Typhon and Echidna, was a remnant of that older, wilder world. By defeating it, Heracles was continuing the work of the gods, making the world safer for humanity. He was, in a very real sense, civilizing the wilderness and pushing back the darkness. Psychologically, the Nemean lion represented Heracles' own untamed power, the same strength that had been turned against his family during his madness. By confronting and controlling this external monster, Heracles was beginning the long process of mastering the monster within himself. The lion's hide, which he would wear for the rest of his life, was not just armor. It was a constant reminder of the beast he had tamed, a symbol of his own violent nature brought under control and put to good use. In the art and literature of ancient Greece, Heracles wearing the Nemean lion skin became the standard way to depict the hero. Vase paintings, sculptures, and temple friezes showed him thus, and the image persisted into Roman times and beyond. Even today, when we picture Hercules, many of us see him draped in that lion's skin. It's one of the most enduring images from classical mythology, a testament to the power of the story and the lasting impact of the first labor. But for all its importance, the first labor was just the beginning. Eurystheus, furious that Heracles had succeeded and desperate to fulfill Hera's wishes, immediately set the hero another task, one that would be even more dangerous, even more terrible, and even more impossible to survive. If the Nemean lion had been a test of Heracles' strength and adaptability, the second labor would test something else entirely: his ability to think strategically in the face of an enemy that only became stronger when attacked. Eurystheus, still terrified by Heracles' success with the lion, commanded him to destroy the Hydra of Lerna, a serpentine monster that dwelt in the swamps near the ancient city of Lerna in Argolis. Like the Nemean lion, the Lernaean Hydra was born from the most terrible bloodlines in Greek mythology. She was another offspring of Typhon and Echidna, bred by Hera specifically to kill Heracles. The monster made its home in the marshlands surrounding Lake Lerna, a place of mists and murky waters where the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead seemed thin and permeable. Indeed, it was said that one of the entrances to Hades itself lay somewhere in those swamps. The Hydra was a massive serpent with multiple heads. The number varies in different ancient sources, with some saying 7, others 9, and still others claiming the creature had 100 or more. Each head was as large as a horse, with fangs that dripped venom so potent that even to breathe the fumes could kill a man. The monster's blood was equally toxic, capable of poisoning anything it touched. The mere presence of the Hydra made the swamps around Lerna uninhabitable, as the poison seeped into the water and soil, killing plants and animals for miles around. But what made the Hydra truly terrifying, what elevated it from a dangerous beast to a nightmare-made flesh, was its power of regeneration. Whenever one of its heads was cut off, 2 new heads would grow back in its place, each as venomous and deadly as the original. Some accounts added another horrifying detail: one of the Hydra's heads was immortal and could not be killed by any means. The Hydra was, in essence, unkillable. Every attempt to destroy it only made it stronger. It was the perfect weapon against a hero known for his strength and combat prowess. Heracles understood he was facing an unprecedented challenge. The straightforward tactics that had worked against the Nemean lion wouldn't work here. Brute force would only make the situation worse. He needed help, and he needed a plan. So he called upon his nephew and companion Iolaus, the son of his mortal brother Iphicles. Iolaus was young but brave, loyal and quick-witted. He had served as Heracles' charioteer and companion on previous adventures, and Heracles trusted him completely. Together, they traveled to the swamps of Lerna, a journey through increasingly hostile and poisonous territory. The closer they got to the Hydra's lair, the more desolate the landscape became. Plants withered, their leaves blackened by the Hydra's venom. The water in the streams and ponds was murky and foul-smelling. Dead fish floated on the surface, and even the insects seemed to avoid the area. The very air was thick with a poisonous miasma that made breathing difficult. The Hydra lived in a cave beneath a plane tree near the springs of Amymone, one of the sources of the Lernaean lake. The entrance to the cave was partially submerged in the swamp, and bones littered the area around it, the remains of those who had tried to slay the beast and failed. Heracles knew he had to draw the creature out of its lair. Fighting it in the confined space of the cave would be too dangerous. So he dipped his arrows in fire and shot blazing shafts into the entrance of the cave, then shouted challenges at the monster. The Hydra, enraged by the fire and the hero's taunts, emerged in all its terrible glory. The sight was enough to make any mortal flee in terror. The massive coils of the creature's body, covered in glistening scales that shone with an oily, unnatural sheen, emerged from the darkness. One after another, the heads appeared, each one turning to fix its malevolent gaze on Heracles. The heads swayed like deadly cobras, and from the mouths came a hissing that sounded almost like words, as if the monster were trying to speak in some horrible language of pain and death. Heracles readied his weapons. He had his club, newly replaced after the first had broken against the Nemean lion. He had his sword. And he had his determination. As the Hydra lunged at him with multiple heads striking simultaneously, Heracles went on the attack. He swung his club with devastating force, smashing one of the heads. The head exploded in a spray of venom, and Heracles felt a moment of triumph. But the triumph was short-lived. From the stump of the destroyed head, 2 new heads began to grow, pushing out from the severed neck like obscene flowers blooming. Within seconds, 2 fully formed heads were snapping at Heracles where there had been one before. The hero redoubled his efforts, striking at the heads again and again, but each time he destroyed one, 2 more took its place. The Hydra was literally multiplying before his eyes, becoming more dangerous with every attack. To make matters worse, Hera, watching from Olympus and eager to see Heracles fail, sent additional help to the Hydra. A massive crab, a creature large enough to crush a man in its claws, emerged from the swamp and scuttled toward the hero. The crab attacked Heracles' feet, trying to pin him down so the Hydra's many heads could strike unimpeded. Now Heracles was fighting on 2 fronts, dodging the Hydra's poisonous fangs while trying to avoid the crab's crushing claws. In a moment of desperate fury, Heracles crushed the crab beneath his foot, grinding the creature into the swamp mud with such force that the earth itself shook. Hera, though disappointed, honored the crab's service by placing it in the stars as the constellation Cancer, a memorial to the creature that had tried, however briefly, to stop Heracles. But killing the crab didn't solve Heracles' main problem. The Hydra was now bristling with twice as many heads as when the battle began, and Heracles was tiring. The poisonous fumes were affecting him, making his movements slower, his thoughts less clear. He was on the verge of defeat. It was then that Heracles called out to Iolaus for help. The young man had been standing by with the chariot, watching the battle with growing alarm. Now his uncle needed him, and Iolaus proved himself a true hero's companion. Heracles explained the problem. They couldn't simply cut off the heads because more would grow back. They needed to prevent the regeneration. Iolaus, blessed with the quick wit that ran in the family, immediately understood what needed to be done. While Heracles continued to battle the Hydra, Iolaus gathered dead wood from the nearby forest and built a large fire. He used the torches they had brought to light the pyre, and soon he had a blazing inferno. Now came the dangerous part. Working together with perfect coordination, Heracles would strike off one of the Hydra's heads with his sword, and Iolaus would immediately rush in with a burning torch, applying the flame to the stump of the neck before new heads could grow. The searing heat cauterized the wound, sealing it so completely that no regeneration could occur. It was brutal, dangerous work. The Hydra thrashed and writhed in agony, its remaining heads snapping at both heroes, coating them with venomous spray. The heat from the torches combined with the sweltering humidity of the swamp made breathing almost impossible. But Heracles and Iolaus persevered, working their way through the Hydra's many heads one by one. Cut and burn. Cut and burn. The pile of severed heads grew, each one still hissing and snapping even in death, their eyes glowing with unnatural life. Finally, only one head remained, the immortal head, which could not be killed by any means. Heracles took his sword and, with one mighty blow, severed this last head. It continued to live, its jaws snapping at empty air, its eyes burning with undying hatred. Heracles could not destroy it, but he could contain it. He took the still living head and buried it beneath an enormous boulder, a rock so massive that it would take divine strength to move it. There the immortal head would remain, trapped but alive, a testament to the Hydra's eternal nature, gnashing its teeth in futile rage for all eternity. The Hydra's body collapsed into the swamp, dead at last. But Heracles knew the monster still held value for him. He took his arrows and carefully dipped each one in the Hydra's poisonous blood. The venom was so potent that even the smallest scratch from one of these arrows would mean certain death. Any enemy struck by Heracles' arrows from this point forward would die in agony within minutes, regardless of how powerful or divine they might be. The Hydra's poison would become one of Heracles' most effective weapons in the trials to come. When Heracles returned to Eurystheus with news of the Hydra's defeat, the king was once again terrified but also furious. This time, however, he saw an opportunity. Eurystheus declared that the second labor did not count because Heracles had received help from Iolaus. The task, Eurystheus argued, was meant to be completed by Heracles alone. Having a companion assist in the battle meant that this labor was invalid. Heracles was outraged by this decision. It was clearly a technicality designed to prolong his servitude, but there was nothing he could do. The rules had been set by the oracle, and Heracles had agreed to submit to Eurystheus' judgment. He would have to complete additional labors to make up for this one. But beyond the politics and the divine machinations, the second labor revealed something profound about Heracles and about heroism itself. The Lernaean Hydra represented a problem that couldn't be solved by strength alone. It was a puzzle as much as a fight, a challenge that required intelligence, creativity, and most importantly, the willingness to accept help. The hypermasculine ideal of the solitary hero, strong enough to overcome any obstacle on his own, was shown to be insufficient. Real heroism sometimes means recognizing when you need assistance and being wise enough to ask for it. The Hydra also represented the nature of certain problems in life. The more you struggle against them conventionally, the worse they become. It's like fighting quicksand. The thrashing only makes you sink faster. Heracles had to step back, analyze the situation, and find a completely different approach. This intellectual flexibility would serve him well in the labors to come. Psychologically, the Hydra with its regenerating heads can be seen as representing guilt, trauma, or destructive habits. When we try to simply suppress or cut off these psychological difficulties without addressing their root causes, they tend to come back stronger and more numerous. Heracles' and Iolaus' method, cauterizing the wounds to prevent regrowth, represents a more thorough approach to dealing with inner demons, one that prevents their return. The immortal head, which could not be destroyed but could only be buried and contained, might represent the truth that some traumas cannot be entirely eliminated but must be sealed away and kept from harming us. The Hydra's venom, which Heracles transformed from a threat into a tool, represents the way we can take our most painful experiences and use them constructively. The poison that nearly killed him became his greatest weapon. This transformation of trauma into strength is perhaps one of the most important lessons from the second labor. With 2 labors completed, or 1, according to Eurystheus' count, Heracles prepared for his next challenge. The tasks ahead would take him to the far reaches of the known world, testing not just his might but his morality, his wisdom, and his very identity as both mortal and divine. Having faced challenges that tested his strength and his wit, Heracles now faced labors that would test 2 different aspects of heroism: patience and the ability to show restraint, followed immediately by the opposite, pure, overwhelming physical power. These contrasting challenges would demonstrate that Heracles was not merely a brute force but a complete hero, capable of adapting to whatever the situation required. The Ceryneian Hind, a year of sacred pursuit. For his third labor, Eurystheus commanded Heracles to capture the Ceryneian Hind and bring it back alive to Tiryns. On the surface, this might seem like a simpler task than battling deadly monsters. After all, Heracles had strangled an invincible lion and destroyed a regenerating serpent. How hard could it be to catch a deer? But this was no ordinary deer. The Ceryneian Hind, also called the Golden Hind, was a massive female deer that dwelt in the hills around Cerynea in Achaea. It was larger than a bull, with golden antlers that shone like the sun, a strange feature indeed, as female deer do not normally have antlers at all. Its hooves were made of bronze, and some accounts said it breathed fire. Most importantly, the hind was sacred to Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt and the wild places, Apollo's twin sister. The sacred nature of the hind was the real challenge. Artemis was one of the most powerful Olympian gods, and she was notoriously protective of the creatures under her care. She had supposedly captured 5 hinds near the Anorus River in Thessaly and yoked 4 of them to her golden chariot. The 5th had escaped, fleeing to Serenia, where it lived under the goddess's divine protection. To harm the hind would be to insult Artemis herself, and the goddess's wrath was legendary. She had transformed men into stags to be torn apart by their own hunting dogs for merely glimpsing her bathing. What would she do to someone who killed one of her sacred animals? Eurystheus was counting on this. He believed that Heracles would be forced to choose between 2 impossible options: fail to capture the hind and thus fail the labor, or harm the hind and face Artemis's divine retribution. Either way, Heracles would be destroyed. But Heracles found a third path. He would capture the hind alive, without shedding a single drop of its blood, and thus complete the task without giving offense to Artemis. The only problem was that the Ceryneian hind was the fastest creature alive. It could outrun arrows in flight. It could run for days without tiring. Catching it would require something Heracles had rarely needed before: patience. Thus began one of the most remarkable chases in all of mythology. Heracles pursued the hind for an entire year, following it from Cerynea through the mountains and valleys of Greece, north into Thrace and the land of the Hyperboreans beyond, even to the very edges of the known world. The hind would run during the day, and Heracles would track it. At night, when the hind slept, Heracles would draw close, but never close enough to capture it before it awoke and fled again. This year of pursuit transformed Heracles in ways that fighting monsters could not. He learned to move silently through the forest, to read the subtle signs that showed where the hind had passed. He learned to match the rhythm of his breathing to the rhythm of the land, to become part of the wilderness rather than fighting against it. He learned, most importantly, to be patient, to wait for the perfect moment rather than trying to force a solution through sheer power. The ancient sources differ on exactly how Heracles finally captured the hind. In some versions, he tracked it to the banks of the river Ladon in Arcadia, where the exhausted creature finally stopped to drink. In other tellings, the chase ended near Mount Artemisium, named for the goddess herself. Some say Heracles caught the hind while it slept, using nets to entangle it without causing harm. Others claim he shot it with a specially designed arrow that passed between the bone and tendon of its leg, causing the minimum possible injury while still bringing the creature down. The most popular version has Heracles finally cornering the hind at the river, and in a moment of perfect timing, shooting an arrow that pinned together the legs of the hind without drawing blood, catching it between the tendon and bone so cleverly that it could not run but was not truly wounded. But as Heracles lifted the bound hind onto his shoulders to carry it back to Eurystheus, he encountered the very god he had been trying not to offend. Artemis appeared before him, her bow drawn, her eyes blazing with divine anger. Beside her stood her brother Apollo, equally furious at this mortal who dared to lay hands on a sacred creature. The moment was tense beyond description. Here stood Heracles, the greatest of heroes, facing 2 of the most powerful Olympian gods, with the injured hind in his arms. What followed was not a battle but a negotiation. Heracles fell to his knees, still holding the hind carefully, and explained his situation. He told Artemis of the madness sent by Hera, of the murder of his family, of his need to atone through these labors. He assured her that he had no wish to harm her sacred animal, that he had spent a full year pursuing it carefully to ensure he caused the least possible damage. He pointed out that the hind was not truly injured, only pinned, and that he would gladly release it as soon as Eurystheus had seen it and acknowledged the completion of the labor. Artemis, who understood the ways of honor, and the necessity of duty, was moved by Heracles' plea. She could see that he had treated her hind with respect, that he had pursued it as a sacred hunter rather than a brutal captor. She agreed to let him complete his task on one condition: the hind must be released unharmed, returned to the wild to run free once more. Heracles readily agreed. He carried the hind all the way back to Tiryns and presented it to Eurystheus. The king, viewing it from a safe distance within his bronze jar, ordered Heracles to release the creature so he could add it to his menagerie. But Heracles, clever as always, told Eurystheus that he would need to release his hold on the hind so that the king himself could take possession of it. He suggested that Eurystheus come and grasp the ropes that bound the creature while Heracles held it steady. The cowardly king, eager to own such a magnificent beast and not thinking clearly in his excitement, agreed. He climbed out of his jar and approached. As he reached for the ropes, Heracles deliberately released his grip a fraction too early. The hind, sensing freedom, broke the bindings with its supernatural strength and bounded away, disappearing into the hills faster than any I could follow, returning to the wild places sacred to Artemis. Heracles turned to Eurystheus with feigned surprise and regret, saying that the king simply hadn't been fast enough. There was nothing to be done, the sacred hind was gone. Eurystheus, furious at being outsmarted but unable to prove that Heracles had done anything wrong, had no choice but to acknowledge that the labor had been completed successfully. The hind had been captured and brought to Tiryns, just as commanded. That it had escaped was the king's own fault. The third labor taught Heracles that heroism wasn't always about the fastest or most forceful approach. Sometimes, the heroic path required patience, respect, and cunning. It showed that real strength included knowing when not to use brute force, understanding when to wait for the right moment, and having the wisdom to navigate complex situations involving divine powers. The Erymanthian boar, catching chaos. After the delicate, year-long pursuit of the Ceryneian hind, Eurystheus set Heracles a labor that required exactly the opposite approach. The fourth task was to capture the Erymanthian boar alive and bring it to Tiryns. This was not a sacred animal under divine protection. This was a force of pure, destructive chaos that terrorized the countryside around Mount Erymanthus in Arcadia. The Erymanthian boar was enormous, possibly the largest boar that had ever lived. Its tusks were as long as swords, capable of goring a man or even knocking down trees. Its hide was thick and tough, not impervious like the Nemean lions but still difficult to penetrate. The boar was phenomenally strong and equally vicious, charging at anything that came near its territory with murderous intent. It had destroyed crops, demolished homes, and killed many people who had been unlucky enough to cross its path. Unlike the hind, which had to be captured through patience and careful tracking, the boar would need to be subdued through controlled violence and direct confrontation. Heracles would have to face the creature head-on, match its strength with his own, and somehow bring it back alive despite its desperate attempts to kill him. Heracles set out for Mount Erymanthus in the dead of winter, believing that the deep snow would help him in his task. As he traveled through the mountains, he stopped at the cave of Pholus, a centaur and an old friend. Unlike most centaurs, who were known for their wild and often violent nature, Pholus was civilized and hospitable. He welcomed Heracles warmly and prepared a meal for his guest. During dinner, Heracles asked Pholus to open a jar of wine, a special wine that belonged communally to all the centaurs in the region. Pholus was hesitant, warning that the wine was sacred and that opening it might anger the other centaurs. But Heracles insisted, perhaps thoughtlessly, that a guest should be offered the best hospitality, and Pholus reluctantly agreed. The moment the jar was opened, the intoxicating aroma of the wine spread across the mountainside, reaching the caves and dwellings of the other centaurs. These centaurs, smelling their precious wine being drunk by an outsider, flew into a rage. They armed themselves and attacked Pholus's cave, attempting to drive out or kill the intruder who had dared to open their wine. Heracles was forced to defend himself. He fought off the attacking centaurs, using his arrows dipped in the hydra's poison, the centaurs had no chance. Each arrow strike, no matter how minor, was fatal. The poison worked instantly, causing excruciating pain and quick death. The centaurs, brave but outmatched, fell one after another. The battle was terrible, and it had two tragic consequences. First, one of Heracles' arrows struck Chiron, the wise centaur who had been one of Heracles' own teachers. Chiron was immortal, a son of Kronos, and the arrow couldn't kill him. But the pain from the Hydra's poison was unbearable, a torment that would never end. Chiron, the greatest teacher of heroes, the embodiment of wisdom and civilization among the wild centaurs, begged Zeus to be allowed to die, to give up his immortality to escape the eternal suffering. Zeus eventually agreed, and Chiron's spirit was placed among the stars as the constellation Sagittarius. The death of his beloved teacher filled Heracles with guilt and sorrow. Second, Pholus himself died in a freak accident. After the battle, as he was helping to remove the arrows from the bodies of the fallen centaurs, Pholus picked up one of the Hydra-poisoned arrows. He examined it curiously, wondering how such a small thing could be so deadly. The arrow slipped from his grasp and pierced his foot. The poison worked instantly, and Pholus died within minutes, killed by his own curiosity. Heracles was devastated. Two good and innocent centaurs had died because of him, both indirectly, both through accidents rather than intention, but dead nonetheless. He buried Pholus at the base of Mount Erymanthus with full honors, and he mourned for Chiron, adding these new deaths to the burden of guilt he already carried. This incident reminded him painfully that his power could cause harm even when he didn't intend it, that his very presence could bring destruction to those around him. But the labor still needed to be completed. With a heavier heart, Heracles continued his hunt for the Erymanthian boar. He found the massive creature in a dense thicket on the mountainside. Rather than simply charging at it, Heracles used strategy. He deliberately made noise, shouting and crashing through the underbrush, driving the boar out of its lair and up the mountain, higher and higher into the snow. As the boar climbed, the snow got deeper and deeper. The beast's enormous weight became a disadvantage as it began to sink into the heavy drifts. Heracles, wearing his Nemean lion skin and possessing his divine strength, could move across the deep snow more easily. He herded the boar higher still, until the creature found itself floundering in snow so deep that it couldn't charge, couldn't defend itself effectively. Only then did Heracles make his move. He leaped onto the exhausted boar's back, avoiding its thrashing tusks, and wrapped his arms around its massive body. Using chains he had brought for this purpose, he bound the boar's legs, immobilizing it. Then, with the creature still alive and struggling, he lifted the enormous animal onto his shoulders and began the long trek back to Tiryns. The journey back was as much a labor as the capture itself. The boar was tremendously heavy and never stopped trying to break free. Its tusks gnashed at the air near Heracles' head. Its body writhed and thrashed. But Heracles' strength was equal to the task. He carried the boar all the way across Greece, an incredible feat of endurance. When he finally arrived in Tiryns and approached the palace, Eurystheus was once again struck with terror. Seeing the massive, struggling boar on Heracles' shoulders, the king dove into his bronze storage jar and refused to come out, shouting commands from the relative safety of his hiding place. Some accounts say that Heracles, fed up with the king's cowardice, simply dumped the still-living boar into the jar with Eurystheus, forcing the king to face his fear directly. Other versions say Heracles simply released the boar in the courtyard, where it had to be dealt with by the king's men. The fourth labor completed, Heracles had demonstrated both his ability to use controlled force and his continuing struggle with unintended consequences. The boar was captured alive as required, but the deaths of Pholus and Chiron cast a shadow over the achievement. It was a reminder that Heracles' journey was not just about completing tasks, but about learning to live with the burdens of power and the unexpected harm that power could cause. Together, the third and fourth labors showed the full spectrum of Heracles' abilities and the complex nature of true heroism. He could be patient when patience was required, fierce when fierceness was needed, gentle with a sacred creature, and powerful enough to subdue a monster. But he was also still learning to control the destructive potential of his own might, still grappling with the guilt that came from causing harm even when he didn't intend it. These labors were shaping him, refining him, slowly transforming him from a man driven by guilt into a true hero driven by purpose. Having proven his ability to blend patience with power, Heracles now faced two consecutive challenges that would require him to rely primarily on his intelligence rather than his legendary strength. These labors would demonstrate that Heracles was far more than a simple strongman. He was a true hero, capable of solving problems that pure might alone could never overcome. The Augean stables, an impossible task made possible. For his fifth labor, Eurystheus commanded Heracles to clean the stables of King Augeas in Elis in a single day. At first glance, this might not seem like a heroic task at all. Cleaning stables was work for servants, not heroes. It was deliberately humiliating, a way for Eurystheus to degrade Heracles by forcing him to perform menial labor. But Eurystheus and Hera had chosen this particular cleaning task very carefully, because the Augean stables were no ordinary stables. King Augeas was the son of the sun god Helios, and he possessed the largest herd of cattle in all of Greece. Sources vary, but most claim he owned at least 3,000 head of cattle, with some accounts going as high as 12,000. More importantly, the stables housing these vast herds had never been cleaned. Not once. Not in 30 years. The accumulation of dung from thousands of cattle over 3 decades had created a situation that defied imagination. The filth was piled so high that it nearly reached the roofs of the buildings. The smell was overwhelming, poisoning the air for miles around. The waste had begun to contaminate the surrounding fields, killing crops and fouling water sources. It was an environmental disaster, and conventional methods could never clean it in a lifetime, let alone a single day. Having proven his ability to blend patience with power, Heracles now faced 2 consecutive challenges that would require him to rely primarily on his intelligence rather than his legendary strength. These labors would demonstrate that Heracles was far more than a simple strongman. He was a true hero, capable of solving problems that pure might alone could never overcome. The Augean stables, an impossible task made possible. For his fifth labor, Eurystheus commanded Heracles to clean the stables of King Augeas in Elis in a single day. At first glance, this might not seem like a heroic task at all. Cleaning stables was work for servants, not heroes. It was deliberately humiliating, a way for Eurystheus to degrade Heracles by forcing him to perform menial labor. But Eurystheus and Hera had chosen this particular cleaning task very carefully, because the Augean stables were no ordinary stables. King Augeas was the son of the sun god Helios, and he possessed the largest herd of cattle in all of Greece. Sources vary, but most claim he owned at least 3,000 head of cattle, with some accounts going as high as 12,000. More importantly, the stables housing these vast herds had never been cleaned. Not once. Not in 30 years. The accumulation of dung from thousands of cattle over 3 decades had created a situation that defied imagination. The filth was piled so high that it nearly reached the roofs of the buildings. The smell was overwhelming, poisoning the air for miles around. The waste had begun to contaminate the surrounding fields, killing crops and fouling water sources. It was an environmental disaster, and conventional methods could never clean it in a lifetime, let alone a single day. Eurystheus believed this task was truly impossible. Even if Heracles worked at superhuman speed for an entire day, he could not possibly shovel out decades of accumulated waste from thousands of animals. The hero would fail, breaking the terms of his service, and Eurystheus would finally be rid of him. But Heracles approached the problem not with a shovel but with his mind. Before beginning the task, he traveled to King Augeas and made a proposal. He claimed to be a wandering laborer who had heard of the situation with the stables. He offered to clean them completely in a single day in exchange for 1/10 of Augeas's cattle herd. The king, certain that no one could possibly accomplish such a feat, readily agreed. He even brought his son Phyleus as a witness to the bargain. Having secured the agreement, Heracles surveyed the situation carefully. He studied the layout of the land, the position of the stables, and most importantly, the location of two nearby rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus. These rivers flowed down from the mountains with considerable force, and Heracles realized they provided the solution to his problem. Heracles began by knocking holes in the walls of the stables at strategic points. Then he dug massive trenches that would redirect the course of the two rivers. With his divine strength, he moved enormous boulders and dug channels that would have taken 100 men weeks to complete. He worked with incredible speed and precision, sweat pouring down his face, his muscles straining even with his God-given power. Finally, everything was ready. Heracles broke through the last barriers, and the full force of both rivers came rushing through the trenches he had created, pouring into the stables in a tremendous flood. The water swept through the buildings with unstoppable force, carrying away 30 years of accumulated filth in a matter of hours. The rushing water scoured the floors clean, washed away every trace of waste, and carried it all downstream, away from the city and the farmlands. By the end of the day, as the sun was setting, the stables were completely clean. Heracles had succeeded in a task that should have been impossible. He redirected the rivers back to their original courses, and the water level in the stables dropped, leaving them spotless. It was a marvel of engineering and problem-solving, the work of a hero who could think as well as fight. But when Heracles returned to King Augeas to claim his promised payment, the king refused. Augeas had learned that Heracles was performing labors for Eurystheus, and claimed that the cleaning had been done as part of that service, not as an independent contract. Therefore, he argued, he owed Heracles nothing. Even Augeas' own son Phyleus, who had witnessed the original agreement, testified that his father was breaking his word, but Augeas would not listen. He drove both Heracles and his own son out of Elis. When Heracles reported his success to Eurystheus, the king also refused to count the labor as complete. Eurystheus claimed that since Heracles had agreed to accept payment from Augeas, the task didn't count as part of his service to the king. This was the second labor that Eurystheus disqualified on technicalities, meaning that Heracles would need to complete additional labors beyond the original 10. Heracles was furious at both men's deception, but he could do nothing at the moment. He was still bound by his oath to serve Eurystheus. However, he made a private vow that when his servitude was complete, he would return to Elis and make King Augeas pay for his broken promise. And indeed, in later years, after the labors were finished, Heracles did return with an army. He conquered Elis, killed King Augeas and his sons, except for Phyleus, who had spoken truth, and placed Phyleus on the throne of Elis as the righteous king. It was a delayed justice, but justice nonetheless. The cleaning of the Augean stables served multiple symbolic purposes. On one level, it represented purification. Heracles was literally cleaning away filth, which paralleled his spiritual goal of cleansing himself of the guilt from murdering his family. The 30 years of accumulated waste could be seen as representing the weight of sin and pollution that had to be washed away. On another level, it demonstrated that heroism sometimes requires humility. Heracles, the greatest warrior of Greece, had to perform the work of a common laborer. He had to get his hands dirty, literally, in a way that offered no glory or fame. This kind of humbling work was as essential to his transformation as the epic battles with monsters. Most importantly, the labor showed that intelligence and creativity could accomplish what brute force never could. If Heracles had tried to clean the stables by hand, even with his superhuman strength and speed, he would have failed. By stepping back and thinking about the problem strategically, by using the natural resources available to him, he achieved the impossible. This was a lesson about the power of working with nature rather than against it, about using your environment as a tool rather than treating every problem as something to be conquered by force. Following the triumph of the stables, Eurystheus set Heracles another task that would require ingenuity over simple strength: drive away or kill the Stymphalian birds that plagued the lake of the same name in Arcadia. The Stymphalian birds were not ordinary waterfowl. They were another remnant of the old, chaotic world that the Olympian gods had fought to tame. Some accounts claimed they were sacred to Ares, the god of war, which would explain their vicious nature. These birds were enormous, with wingspans wide enough to block out the sun when they flew in flocks. Their feathers were made of bronze, sharp as arrows, which they could launch at enemies like deadly projectiles. Their beaks and talons were also bronze, capable of piercing armor and tearing through flesh. Some sources claimed they were man-eaters, hunting humans as prey. Others said they merely destroyed crops and fouled water sources with their toxic droppings, making regions uninhabitable. The birds had taken up residence around Lake Stymphalia in such vast numbers that they had become a plague upon the region. The lake itself was isolated in a mountain valley, surrounded by dense forests and thick marshland that made approach difficult. The birds nested in the trees around the lake, and their numbers were so great that their nests covered every branch. When they took flight, the sky would darken with bronze wings, and the sound of their screeching was deafening. The challenge for Heracles was twofold. First, how could he even reach the birds? The marsh around the lake was too soft to support his weight. If he tried to wade through it, he would sink into the mud. Second, even if he could reach them, there were far too many to fight individually. He could shoot arrows at them all day and hardly make a dent in their population. Heracles went to the lake and surveyed the situation, trying to devise a plan. As he stood on the shore, pondering the problem, he received divine aid from an unexpected source. Athena, the goddess of wisdom who had favored Heracles throughout his trials, appeared before him. She did not speak but handed him a gift, a pair of bronze castanets or, in some versions, a bronze rattle, specially crafted by Hephaestus, the god of forge and craft. Athena explained that the birds were terrified of loud, sudden noises. The bronze instruments she had given him would create a sound so terrible, so jarring, that the birds would panic and flee. Heracles understood immediately. He took the castanets and climbed to a hill overlooking the lake. From this elevated position, he began to clash the bronze instruments together, creating an enormous, echoing din that reverberated across the water and through the valley. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The birds erupted from their nests in a massive flock, screeching in terror and confusion. Thousands upon thousands of bronze-feathered birds took to the air at once, the sound of their wings adding to the cacophony. The sky turned dark with their numbers, and for a moment, they flew in chaotic circles, disoriented and panicked. But Heracles wasn't simply trying to scare them. As the birds rose into the air, making themselves targets, he dropped the castanets and took up his bow. His arrows flew with incredible speed and precision, each one finding its mark. Bird after bird fell from the sky, pierced by Heracles' arrows. Some birds tried to fight back, launching their bronze feathers at him, but his Nemean lion's skin protected him from the deadly projectiles. But Heracles wasn't simply trying to scare them. As the birds rose into the air, making themselves targets, he dropped the castanets and took up his bow. His arrows flew with incredible speed and precision, each one finding its mark. Bird after bird fell from the sky, pierced by Heracles' arrows. Some birds tried to fight back, launching their bronze feathers at him, but his Nemean lion's skin protected him from the deadly projectiles. The battle was brief but intense. Heracles shot down many of the birds, thinning their numbers significantly. But more importantly, the surviving birds, traumatized by the terrible noise and the death of their companions, fled the lake entirely. They flew north and never returned to Lake Stymphalia. According to some accounts, these birds eventually ended up on the island of Heracles in the Black Sea, where they would later be encountered by Jason and the Argonauts during their quest for the Golden Fleece. With the birds driven away or killed, the region around Lake Stymphalia became habitable again. The farmers could return to their fields, the water became clean once more, and the sound of the bird's horrible screeching no longer haunted the valleys. Heracles collected some of the bronze feathers as proof of his success and returned to Eurystheus. The sixth labor, like the fifth, demonstrated that being a hero meant more than having physical power. It required the ability to assess a situation, understand when direct confrontation wasn't the answer, and be willing to use tools and tactics rather than relying solely on one's own might. Heracles could certainly have tried to fight the birds one by one, but he never would have succeeded in driving them all away. By using the castanets given to him by Athena, by combining divine assistance with his own skill with the bow, he achieved victory efficiently and effectively. The labor also illustrated an important point about accepting help. Heracles received divine aid from Athena, and this didn't diminish his achievement. Some have argued that this assistance should have disqualified the labor, just as Iolaus' help with the Hydra supposedly disqualified that task. But Eurystheus accepted this labor as complete, perhaps because the aid Heracles received was minimal compared to his own effort, or perhaps because Eurystheus was simply running out of ideas for impossible tasks. Psychologically, the Stymphalian birds could represent intrusive thoughts, anxieties, or worries that plague a person's peace of mind. Like birds that roost in great numbers and refuse to leave, these psychological disturbances can seem overwhelming and impossible to eliminate. But with the right tools, symbolized by Athena's castanets, and determined effort, they can be driven away, allowing peace to return. With 6 labors completed, Heracles had proven himself capable of applying both force and intelligence, patience and urgency, humility and pride. The remaining labors would take him even further from home, into stranger lands and more impossible situations, each one designed to break him but instead forging him into something greater than any mortal hero had ever been. Having completed 6 labors in the Peloponnese and the nearby regions of Greece, Heracles now faced tasks that would take him far beyond familiar lands. These new labors would test not just his might and wit but his endurance and his ability to navigate foreign kingdoms and strange cultures. The journey of transformation was leading him ever outward, away from everything he knew. The Cretan bull, madness incarnate. For his 7th labor, Eurystheus sent Heracles to the island of Crete to capture the ferocious bull that was terrorizing that land. This was no ordinary bull. The Cretan bull was, according to some accounts, the same magnificent white bull that Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, had sent to King Minos years earlier. The story behind the bull was a dark one. Minos had prayed to Poseidon to validate his claim to the throne of Crete by sending a bull from the sea. If the god showed favor, Minos promised to sacrifice the bull back to Poseidon as an offering. The sea god responded by sending the most beautiful bull ever seen, a massive creature with a coat as white as foam, perfect in every way. But when Minos saw how magnificent the bull was, he couldn't bring himself to kill it. Instead, he kept it for himself and sacrificed a lesser bull in its place, believing Poseidon wouldn't notice or wouldn't care about this substitution. But the gods always notice broken promises. Poseidon, furious at being cheated, caused Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae, to fall in love with the bull in a mad, unnatural passion. Through the craftsmanship of Daedalus, who built a hollow wooden cow for her to hide in, Pasiphae mated with the bull. From this unholy union was born the Minotaur, half man, half bull, a monster that would eventually be trapped in the labyrinth beneath the palace of Knossos and fed on human sacrifices until the hero Theseus killed it years later. But that part of the story was still in the future. For now, the bull itself had been driven mad by Poseidon's curse. It rampaged across Crete, breathing fire from its nostrils, destroying everything in its path. It trampled crops, knocked down buildings, gored anyone who came near, and created general chaos across the island. King Minos and his people were desperate for someone to remove this threat. When Heracles arrived on Crete and met with King Minos, he explained his task. Minos, recognizing an opportunity to be rid of the bull without having to risk his own men, gladly gave Heracles permission to capture the creature. In fact, he offered to help, though his help likely consisted mainly of pointing Heracles in the right direction and wishing him luck. Heracles tracked the bull across the island, following the trail of destruction it left behind. When he finally found the beast, it was in full fury, charging at phantom enemies and bellowing with rage. Its eyes were wild with the madness that Poseidon had inflicted upon it. Fire streamed from its nostrils with each angry breath, scorching the ground around it. It was a creature entirely lost to reason, a force of pure chaotic violence. Rather than trying to kill the bull, Heracles had to subdue it alive, as those were his instructions. He waited for the right moment, watching the bull's movements, learning its patterns even in its madness. Then, as the bull charged past him at full speed, Heracles leaped upon its back, wrapping his arms around its thick neck just below the head, hanging on as the bull tried desperately to throw him off. What followed was a rodeo of mythical proportions. The bull bucked and twisted, trying every way it could think of to dislodge the hero clinging to its back. It charged at walls, trying to crush Heracles against stone. It rolled on the ground, attempting to grind him beneath its massive weight. But Heracles held on with superhuman strength, gradually wearing the creature down. Finally, exhausted from its struggles, the bull began to tire. Heracles shifted his grip, getting one arm around the bull's head and the other around its neck, and began to squeeze. He didn't strangle the bull, but he cut off enough air to make the creature dizzy and weak. When the bull's legs began to buckle, Heracles wrapped ropes around it, binding its legs so it couldn't charge, and securing its head so it couldn't gore him with its horns. The return journey was extraordinary. Heracles couldn't take the bull back by ship. It would have destroyed any vessel. Instead, some accounts say he led the bound bull through the water itself, swimming with the creature from Crete back to the Greek mainland. Others claim he rode on the bull's back across the waves, the creature's divine heritage allowing it to traverse the sea like a living boat. However he accomplished it, Heracles successfully transported the Cretan bull all the way across the sea and then overland to Tiryns. When Eurystheus saw the magnificent but dangerous bull, he initially planned to sacrifice it to Hera as a way of honoring the goddess who had inspired these labors. But Hera, wanting nothing connected with Heracles' success to be associated with her worship, refused the sacrifice. So Eurystheus released the bull, thinking he was rid of it. This turned out to be a terrible mistake. The bull, still mad, wandered across the Peloponnese causing havoc wherever it went. It eventually made its way to Marathon, near Athens, where it became known as the Marathonian bull. It would terrorize that region until it was finally killed years later by another hero, Theseus, in one of his own great adventures. So while Heracles had completed his labor successfully, the story of the Cretan bull didn't end happily for everyone involved. The seventh labor represented several important themes. The bull itself was a victim, driven mad not by any fault of its own but because a king had broken a promise to a god. Heracles' task was to subdue this madness, to control and redirect this dangerous force. In a psychological sense, this paralleled Heracles' own situation. He had been driven to murder his family by a madness sent from Hera, and now he was working to control and atone for that action. The bull also represented untamed masculine energy, powerful, potentially creative, but destructive when not properly channeled or respected. Minos's failure to honor his promise to Poseidon had unleashed forces that spiraled into tragedy, the Minotaur being the ultimate result. Heracles' ability to subdue the bull showed his growing mastery over these primal forces, both external and internal. The Mares of Diomedes, breaking the cycle of violence. For his eighth labor, Heracles was sent to Thrace, the wild region north of Greece, to capture the Mares of King Diomedes. These were not ordinary horses. They were 4 Mares that had been bred and raised by Diomedes specifically for their savage nature. Their names were Podargos, Swift, Lampon, Shining, Xanthos, Yellow, and Danos, Terrible, and they lived up to their fearsome reputations. What made these horses truly monstrous was their diet. They fed on human flesh. King Diomedes, a son of Ares the war god and a cruel tyrant, kept his stables supplied by feeding unsuspecting guests and travelers to his horses. It was the ultimate violation of the sacred Greek custom of xenia, hospitality to strangers. Instead of protecting those who came to his kingdom seeking shelter, Diomedes would capture them and cast them into the stables where the mares would tear them apart and devour them. This abhorrent practice had made the horses wild and uncontrollable. They had to be chained to bronze mangers with heavy chains because they would attack anyone who came near. Their teeth were said to be like iron, capable of tearing through flesh and bone. Their very breath was poisonous. They were nightmares made flesh, the physical embodiment of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the breakdown of civilization. Heracles approached this labor methodically. He didn't go alone. He gathered a group of brave companions to help him, knowing that handling 4 man-eating horses would be difficult even for him. Among these companions was a young man named Abderus, of whom Heracles was particularly fond. Some ancient sources suggest he was Heracles Ereminos, his younger beloved in the Greek tradition of pederastic mentorship and love. When Heracles and his companions arrived in Thrace, they went directly to the stables where the mares were kept. Using his enormous strength, Heracles knocked out the grooms who guarded the stables and broke the chains that bound the horses. But rather than trying to immediately subdue the mares, he drove them down to the sea, to a nearby peninsula where they would be trapped by the water. King Diomedes, learning that his precious horses were being stolen, gathered his warriors and pursued Heracles and his companions. As the Thracians approached, Heracles faced a difficult decision. He could fight Diomedes and his men personally, but that would mean leaving the horses unguarded, and they might escape. So he made a choice that he would come to regret. He left young Abderus to guard the mares while he dealt with the attacking Thracians. The battle between Heracles and Diomedes' warriors was brief and brutal. Heracles' rage at the king's violation of sacred hospitality made him even more formidable than usual. He cut through the Thracian warriors like wheat before a scythe, and when he reached Diomedes himself, he seized the king bodily and dragged him back toward the captured horses. But when Heracles returned to where he had left Abderus, he found a horrific scene. The young man had tried to control the mares, but they had overpowered him. They had torn him apart and devoured him, leaving barely anything recognizable. Heracles' beloved companion, left in his charge, was dead, killed by the very horses Heracles had been sent to capture. In his grief and fury, Heracles decided on a form of poetic justice. He took King Diomedes, who had fed so many innocent people, to his horses, and threw the king to the mares himself. The horses, recognizing their cruel master, fell upon him with savage hunger. Diomedes' screams were brief, and when the horses had finished with him, Heracles noticed something remarkable. Their behavior had changed. Whether it was because they had been fed the man who had made them into monsters, or simply because their hunger was finally satisfied, the mares became calmer, more manageable. Their wildness was not gone, but it was reduced to something that could be controlled. Heracles, his heart heavy with grief for Abderus, led the now subdued mares back to Tiryns. Before leaving Thrace, he founded a city in honor of his fallen companion, Abdera, which would become a great city of the ancient world. The memory of the young man who died protecting the horses would be preserved in stone and story. When the mares were presented to Eurystheus, the king was terrified of them despite their somewhat calmer demeanor. According to some accounts, he dedicated them to Hera and released them. The horses eventually made their way to Mount Olympus, where they were eaten by wild animals, a fitting end for beasts that had themselves eaten so many humans. The eighth labor dealt with themes of justice and the cyclical nature of violence. Diomedes had created monsters by feeding them human flesh. He had taken the natural power of horses and corrupted it into something evil. His punishment was to become victim to his own creation, literally consumed by the violence he had nurtured. It was a dark form of justice, but perhaps the only appropriate one for such a crime. For Heracles, the labor was personally costly. The death of Abderus added another name to the list of those who had died because of him, or in his service. Pholus, Chiron, and now Abderus, all casualties of Heracles' labors. The hero was learning that great deeds often came with great costs, that saving the world from monsters sometimes meant sacrificing those closest to you. The maras of Diomedes can be interpreted as representing base desires and passions that have been fed until they consume everything else. When we nurture our worst impulses, feeding them until they become monstrous, they eventually turn on us. The only way to tame them is to recognize their source, in this case, the cruel king who had created their evil nature, and address that root cause. With 8 labors completed, Heracles had traveled from the southern Peloponnese to the islands of the sea to the wilds of Thrace. He had faced beasts that tested his strength, his patience, his intelligence, and his heart. But the most challenging labors were still to come, tasks that would take him to the very edges of the world, to places where the boundaries between mortal and divine, between life and death, were thin as gossamer thread. As Heracles progressed through his labors, the tasks grew increasingly complex, testing not just his physical abilities but his capacity to navigate political intrigue, gender dynamics, and journeys to the far reaches of the known world. The next 2 labors would challenge him in ways that strength alone could never overcome. For his 9th labor, Eurystheus commanded Heracles to obtain the belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. The request didn't come from the king himself but from his daughter Admete, who had heard tales of this magnificent belt and desired it for herself. The belt, given to Hippolyta by her father Ares, the god of war, was a symbol of her authority and power. It was said to be adorned with gold and precious stones, and it granted the wearer legitimacy as ruler of the warrior women. The Amazons were a nation of fierce female warriors who lived somewhere in the regions around the Black Sea. Different sources placed them in various locations, from Scythia to Pontus to Themyscira. They were renowned throughout the ancient world for their skill in battle. Amazon women trained from childhood in all the martial arts. They were expert horse riders and skilled archers. Some accounts claimed they would burn off or bind their right breast in youth to make drawing a bow easier, though this detail is disputed by many scholars. The Amazons lived separately from men, meeting with neighboring tribes only for the purpose of conception. Male children were either killed or sent away to their fathers. All female children were kept and trained as warriors. Hippolyta herself was formidable even among the Amazons. As queen, she was the greatest warrior of her people, undefeated in single combat. The belt she wore was not just decorative. It was a magical artifact that symbolized her divine right to rule, blessed by Ares himself. To take it would be to challenge the autonomy and power of the entire Amazon nation. Heracles understood that this labor was different from battling monsters. He was being asked to take something precious from a people who had done nothing wrong, whose only crime was possessing something that Eurystheus' spoiled daughter wanted. So rather than sailing to the land of the Amazons with the intention of fighting them, Heracles decided to try diplomacy first. He gathered a group of Greece's greatest heroes to accompany him, including Theseus, Telamon, and others, and set sail for Themyscira. When Heracles and his companions arrived, they were met with curiosity rather than instant hostility. The Amazons were warriors, yes, but they were also a civilized people with their own culture and customs. Queen Hippolyta herself came down to the ships to meet these Greek heroes she had heard so much about. She and Heracles spoke, and according to most accounts, Hippolyta was impressed by the hero. She had heard of his great deeds, and she respected strength in others. When Heracles explained his situation, that he was bound by fate to complete these labors as atonement for crimes committed in madness, Hippolyta sympathized with him. In perhaps the greatest display of her nobility, Hippolyta agreed to give Heracles her belt willingly. She understood the compulsion that drove him, and she chose to help him rather than fight him. It seemed the 9th labor would be completed through peaceful diplomacy, without a single sword drawn in anger. Heracles would have the belt, and the Amazons would have their honor intact. having given the gift freely rather than having it taken by force. But Hera, watching from Olympus and furious that Heracles was about to complete another labor so easily, decided to intervene. The goddess disguised herself as an Amazon warrior and moved through the ranks of Hippolyta's people, spreading lies and rumors. She whispered that the Greek heroes weren't here for a belt at all. They were here to kidnap Hippolyta herself. The Greeks, Hera claimed, were planning to seize their queen and carry her off to slavery in Greece. The Amazons, fiercely protective of their queen and their independence, believed the disguised goddess. They armed themselves and attacked the Greek ships before Heracles and Hippolyta could complete their peaceful exchange. The battle was sudden and furious. The Amazons fought with all the skill they were famous for, raining arrows down on the Greeks and charging on horseback with spears leveled. Heracles, confused and then enraged by what he perceived as a treacherous ambush, fought back. In the chaos of battle, not knowing which Amazons had been deceived by Hera, and which were genuinely trying to kill him, Heracles struck out at any warrior who attacked him. In many versions of the myth, the tragic outcome was that Heracles killed Hippolyta herself in the fighting, believing she had deceived him about offering the belt freely. In other versions, he simply fought his way to her and took the belt by force before sailing away with his companions. The battle ended with heavy casualties on both sides. The Greeks managed to board their ships and escape, taking with them not just Hippolyta's belt but also, in some accounts, her sister Antiope, whom Theseus had fallen in love with during the conflict. The Amazons were left to mourn their dead and their loss, betrayed by a goddess's lies into a fight that need never have happened. As Heracles sailed away, he reflected bitterly on the outcome of the ninth labor. He had tried to do things peacefully. Hippolyta had been willing to help him. But divine intervention had turned potential friendship into violence and death. It was a reminder of the cruel game the gods were playing with his life, and of how his very presence seemed to bring conflict and tragedy even when he tried to prevent it. When Heracles returned to Tiryns and presented the belt to Admete through Eurystheus, the king was pleased that the labor was complete. But there was no glory in this achievement for Heracles, only a sense of waste and loss. Diplomacy had failed not through any fault of his own, but because the gods themselves preferred war to peace. The ninth labor dealt with themes of gender, power, and the cost of divine manipulation. The Amazons represented an alternative form of society, one where women held power and proved themselves equal or superior to men in martial prowess. Heracles' encounter with them could have been a meeting of equals, a recognition of mutual strength and respect. Instead, it became a tragedy orchestrated by Hera's jealous vengeance. Psychologically, the belt of Hippolyta might represent the struggle to reconcile different aspects of power, masculine and feminine, physical and emotional, individual and collective. Heracles was forced to take by violence what could have been given freely, another instance of his strength creating harm rather than good, despite his best intentions. For his 10th labor, Heracles faced what was perhaps the most geographically challenging task yet. He was commanded to steal the cattle of Geryon and drive them back to Greece. This seemingly simple task of cattle rustling was actually incredibly difficult because of where Geryon lived and what Geryon was. Geryon dwelt on the island of Erythea, which was located in the far west, beyond the edge of the known world. In ancient Greek geography, this meant somewhere past the Pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, out in the great ocean that surrounded all lands. It was a place of myth and mystery, where the sun god Helios ended his daily journey across the sky and where the normal rules of the mortal world did not necessarily apply. Geryon himself was a monster, though not in the same way as the Nemean lion or the Hydra. Geryon was a giant with 3 complete bodies joined at the waist. Different accounts describe this differently. Some say he had 3 heads, 6 arms, and 6 legs all on a single torso. Others describe him as essentially 3 complete men merged together. He was the grandson of Medusa and thus related to other famous monsters. His cattle were magnificent red bulls and cows, tended by the herdsman Eurytion and guarded by Orthrus, a two-headed dog that was the brother of Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. The journey to Erythea was an adventure in itself. Heracles traveled through North Africa, facing numerous challenges along the way. He fought various monsters and bandits who tried to stop him. The heat of the African sun was so intense that Heracles actually drew his bow and shot an arrow at Helios in frustration, threatening the sun god itself. Helios, rather than being offended, was amused by Heracles' audacity and decided to help him. The sun god loaned Heracles his golden cup, the vessel that carried Helios from the west back to the east each night through the ocean. Using this golden cup as a boat, Heracles sailed across the ocean to Erythea. Some accounts say he also had to fight with Ocean itself, the god of the great sea that encircled the world, battling the divine waters that threatened to capsize the cup. But Heracles prevailed and reached the island where Geryon's cattle grazed. Upon his arrival, Heracles immediately sought out the cattle. Orthrus, the two-headed watchdog, attacked him on sight, barking from both mouths and lunging at the hero with savage intensity. But Heracles had faced worse monsters, and he killed Orthrus with a single swing of his club, crushing both heads at once. The herdsman Eurytion, seeing his dog killed and understanding that the cattle were being stolen, attacked Heracles as well, trying to defend his master's property. Heracles killed him too, though accounts suggest he did so reluctantly, as Eurytion was just a man doing his job. Geryon himself heard the commotion and came to investigate. When he saw the intruder stealing his cattle, having already killed his dog and his herdsman, Geryon flew into a rage. The battle between Heracles and the three-bodied giant was fierce. Geryon attacked with 3 sets of arms wielding 3 spears and 3 shields. He was, in essence, fighting like 3 warriors at once, attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. But Heracles had an advantage that Geryon couldn't overcome, his arrows tipped with the Hydra's poison. According to the most common version, Heracles shot a single arrow that passed through all 3 of Geryon's bodies at once, piercing them in a straight line. The Hydra's venom acted instantly, and Geryon, for all his monstrous power, fell dead. Some accounts claim that Hera appeared during the battle, trying to help Geryon, but Heracles shot at her as well, wounding the goddess and forcing her to retreat to Olympus. With Geryon dead, Heracles gathered the cattle and began the long journey back to Greece. He loaded the cattle into Helios's golden cup and sailed back across the ocean, returning the cup to the sun god with thanks. Then began one of the longest and most difficult herd drives in all mythology. Heracles had to drive the cattle all the way from the western edge of the world, through Spain, over the Pyrenees, through Gaul, across the Alps, down into Italy, and finally back to Greece. The journey took months, possibly years. Along the way, Heracles faced numerous challenges. Giants tried to steal the cattle. Bandits attacked. In Italy, a monster named Cacus, a fire-breathing giant who was a son of Vulcan, stole some of the cattle and dragged them backward into his cave so their hoofprints would make it look like they had walked out of Heracles' herd rather than into the cave. But Heracles figured out the trick and killed Cacus, recovering his cattle. When Heracles passed through the region that would later be called France, he founded cities and left marks of his passage. He set up pillars to mark the path he had taken. The very landscape of southern Europe was said to have been shaped by his journey with Geryon's cattle. But Hera wasn't finished tormenting Heracles. When he was close to completing the labor, nearing Tiryns with the cattle intact, Hera sent a gadfly to sting the cattle. The insects drove the animals mad, and they scattered across the Greek countryside. Heracles had to spend additional months tracking down and recapturing all the cattle that had dispersed. He managed to recover most of them, though some accounts say a few were lost permanently. Finally, after what had been the longest and most grueling of all his labors to this point, Heracles delivered the cattle of Geryon to Eurystheus. The king, who had no real use for the cattle and had only assigned this task because it seemed impossible, promptly sacrificed all the animals to Hera, offering them to the goddess who had made Heracles' life such a misery. The 10th labor tested Heracles' endurance more than any before it. It wasn't a single battle or a single task, but rather an extended quest that took him to the literal edge of the world and back again. The journey itself was the trial, a test of whether Heracles had the determination to keep going no matter how far he had to travel, or how many obstacles appeared in his path. Geryon, the three-bodied giant, represented multiplicity and the challenges of fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. Heracles couldn't simply apply greater strength to defeat him. He needed precision, the arrow through all three bodies at once, and strategy, using the poisoned arrows. The cattle themselves can be seen symbolizing wealth and resources that must be brought back from the edges of the unknown, acquired through incredible effort and protected against countless threats. The fact that Hera scattered the cattle at the last moment, forcing Heracles to hunt them down again, represented the way success can slip away at the very moment of completion, requiring renewed effort and perseverance. With 10 labors now officially completed, though Eurystheus had refused to count the Hydra and the Augean stables, meaning Heracles actually needed to do more, the hero had traveled from the heart of Greece to the extremities of the known world. He had faced mortal warriors and immortal monsters. He had relied on strength, intelligence, speed, patience, and the help of gods and mortals alike. But the hardest trials were still ahead, tasks that would literally take him to the edges of life and death itself, to places no mortal had ever ventured and returned from alive. When Eurystheus informed Heracles that 2 of his labors hadn't counted due to technicalities, and that he must perform 2 additional tasks, the king saved the most impossible challenges for last. These final 2 labors would take Heracles beyond the boundaries of the mortal world itself, testing not just whether he could survive but whether he could return from places from which no mortal ever had. They would require him to confront death, immortality, and the very gods themselves. For his 11th labor, Heracles was commanded to bring back the golden apples that grew in the garden of the Hesperides. These were not ordinary apples. They were wedding gifts given by Gaia, the Earth Mother herself, to Hera when she married Zeus. The apples grew on a magical tree in a garden at the western edge of the world, tended by the Hesperides, nymphs who were daughters of the primordial night. The garden was Hera's most precious sanctuary, a place of divine beauty and eternal sunset. The tree was guarded by Ladon, a dragon with 100 heads, each capable of speaking in a different voice. Some sources said Ladon never slept, with some heads always awake and watchful even as others rested. The dragon coiled around the tree perpetually, and its many eyes watched for any who might dare to steal the sacred fruit. Even if someone could somehow get past Ladon, the apples themselves were immortal fruit. Eating them was said to grant eternal life, making them the most precious objects in all of creation. The first challenge Heracles faced with this labor was simply finding the garden of the Hesperides. It was located somewhere far to the west, beyond the setting sun, but no mortal knew exactly where. So Heracles set out on what would become one of the longest journeys of his career, asking gods and heroes for directions, following clues and rumors across half the known world. During this search, Heracles had many adventures. He traveled through Africa and encountered Antaeus, a giant who was a son of Poseidon and Gaia. Antaeus forced all travelers passing through his land to wrestle with him, and he had never been defeated because he drew strength from contact with his mother, the earth. Whenever he was thrown down, he would touch the ground and become stronger. Heracles realized what was happening and adapted his tactics. He lifted Antaeus high into the air and strangled him while holding him aloft, preventing the giant from touching the earth and recharging his power. Heracles also encountered Prometheus, the titan who had stolen fire from the gods and given it to humanity. As punishment, Zeus had chained Prometheus to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where an eagle would come each day to eat his liver. Because Prometheus was immortal, his liver would grow back each night, only to be eaten again the next day, eternal torture for his defiance of Zeus. Heracles, sympathizing with the titan's suffering, shot the eagle with one of his arrows, freeing Prometheus from his daily torment. In gratitude, Prometheus gave Heracles crucial advice: don't attempt to steal the apples yourself. Instead, ask Atlas to retrieve them for you. This advice was brilliant because it identified a loophole in the problem. Ladon guarded the tree against mortal thieves, but Atlas, one of the Titans who had fought against Zeus in the ancient wars, had no such restriction. Atlas was condemned to hold up the sky, or in some versions, the heavens, for all eternity at the western edge of the world, coincidentally very near the Garden of the Hesperides. The daughters of Atlas were, in some accounts, the Hesperides themselves. If anyone could gather the golden apples, it would be Atlas. When Heracles found Atlas, standing bent beneath the weight of the celestial sphere, he explained his predicament. Atlas, who was understandably tired of his eternal burden, saw an opportunity. He agreed to fetch the apples if Heracles would temporarily take his place holding up the sky. Heracles, desperate to complete this labor and trusting in his strength, agreed. What Heracles experienced next tested him more than any monster ever had. The moment he took the weight of the heavens onto his shoulders, he understood the true extent of Atlas's punishment. The weight was beyond anything he had ever felt. It was the weight of all the stars, all the planets, the entire vault of heaven. It was cosmic in scale, crushing beyond measure. Heracles' divine strength was barely sufficient. He strained with every fiber of his being, his muscles threatening to tear, his bones creaking under the incomprehensible load. Even the slightest loss of focus or balance would result in the sky crashing down onto the earth, ending all life in existence. Atlas, meanwhile, was free for the first time in countless ages. He stretched, his joints cracking, and then set off to get the apples. Some accounts say he had to fight or trick Ladon to access the fruit. Others suggest the dragon recognized Atlas and allowed him to pass. Either way, Atlas successfully retrieved 3 of the golden apples and returned to where Heracles stood, still straining under the weight of the heavens. But Atlas had been thinking during his brief freedom. Why should he go back to bearing this terrible burden? Heracles seemed capable of holding the sky. Perhaps he could continue doing so. Atlas announced that he had changed his mind. He would deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself. Heracles could stay here and hold up the heavens permanently. Thanks for your help, goodbye. Heracles, barely able to speak under the crushing weight, realized he was in serious trouble. He couldn't force Atlas to take back the burden. He literally couldn't move to attack or threaten the Titan without dropping the sky. He needed to use his mind, not his muscles. So, pretending to accept Atlas's decision, Heracles made one simple request. Could Atlas take the weight back for just a moment so Heracles could adjust his cloak, or, in some versions, fashion a cushion for his shoulders? The burden was so heavy, Heracles explained, and without some padding, he couldn't hold it properly. Atlas, not thinking clearly after his brief taste of freedom and not expecting such a simple trick, agreed. He set down the apples and took the sky back onto his shoulders, believing it would only be for a moment, while Heracles adjusted his clothing. But the instant Atlas had the weight back, Heracles grabbed the golden apples and walked away, calling back thanks for Atlas's help. The Titan roared in fury, realizing he'd been outwitted, but there was nothing he could do. He couldn't chase Heracles without dropping the sky, and so he was stuck once again with his eternal punishment. Some versions of the myth add a poignant detail. Before leaving, Heracles, sympathizing with Atlas's plight despite the Titan's attempted betrayal, promised to one day help free him from this burden. Indeed, in some later myths, this promise is said to have been kept. Heracles returned to Tiryns with the golden apples and presented them to Eurystheus. The king was amazed that Heracles had succeeded in this seemingly impossible task. But the apples were sacred to Hera and couldn't simply be kept by a mortal. So they were given to Athena, who returned them to the Garden of the Hesperides where they belong. The tree, the dragon, and the nymphs continued their eternal vigil, and the cycle continued. The 11th labor was rich with symbolic meaning. Heracles had literally held up the world, shouldering a burden that represented ultimate responsibility and cosmic weight. In many ways, This labor encapsulated his entire journey, taking on burdens that should be impossible, bearing weights that would crush normal men, yet persevering through sheer will and divine strength. The apples themselves represented immortality, the ultimate goal of Heracles' labors. He was promised that if he completed his service, he would become a god, immortal like his father Zeus. These golden apples, which granted eternal life to those who ate them, were physically close but remained tantalizingly out of reach. He could touch them, carry them, but not consume them. It was a reminder that immortality had to be earned, not taken. Atlas's situation, tricked into accepting his burden back, showed that even the cleverest plans could backfire, and that sometimes the simplest tricks were the most effective. Heracles had used brute force to defeat the Nemean lion, intelligence to clean the Augean stables, patience to catch the Ceryneian hind, and now cleverness to outsmart a titan. He was becoming a complete hero, skilled in all aspects of what heroism required. The labor also dealt with themes of cosmic order. Atlas held up the heavens to maintain the separation between earth and sky, the order that Zeus had established when he defeated the Titans. By temporarily taking on this role, Heracles participated in maintaining cosmic order, showing that he was worthy of joining the divine realm. For his 12th and final labor, Eurystheus gave Heracles the most terrifying task imaginable: descend into the underworld, capture Cerberus, the guardian hound of Hades, and bring the creature to the surface world to show to Eurystheus. This was beyond anything that had come before. Heracles was being asked to literally go to the land of the dead and return alive. It was a journey from which no mortal ever came back. Cerberus was no ordinary dog. He was a massive hound with 3 heads, though some ancient sources claim he had 50 or even 100 heads, a serpent for a tail, and snakes writhing along his back. He was the brother of Orthrus, the 2-headed dog Heracles had killed while stealing Geryon's cattle, and like his brother, he was an offspring of the monsters Typhon and Echidna. Cerberus served a specific function in the cosmic order. He guarded the entrance to the underworld, preventing the dead from escaping and the living from entering. His 3 heads watched all directions at once, and no one could pass without permission from Hades himself. Before attempting this labor, Heracles needed to prepare. He traveled to Eleusis and underwent the Eleusinian mysteries, the sacred rituals that taught initiates about death and the afterlife. This spiritual preparation was essential. Heracles needed to understand death itself before he could face it directly. The mysteries changed those who experienced them, giving them a different perspective on mortality and the journey of the soul. Heracles also sought out divine guidance. Athena and Hermes, as the guide of souls to the underworld, agreed to accompany him. The gods could travel between worlds freely, and they would help Heracles navigate the realm of the dead. With their assistance, Heracles found one of the secret entrances to Hades, at Taenarus in Laconia, though some sources place it elsewhere. The descent was harrowing. As Heracles traveled down into the earth, the sunlight faded behind him, replaced by a cold darkness that seemed to seep into his bones. The path led through caves and tunnels that grew increasingly stranger and more dreamlike. Eventually, he reached the river Styx, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Charon, the grim ferryman who transported souls across the Styx, initially refused to take Heracles. The living were not permitted in the realm of the dead. But Heracles, desperate and perhaps reverting to his more impulsive nature, glared at Charon with such intensity that the ferryman, frightened, agreed to row him across. For this violation of the rules, Charon would later be punished by Hades, forced to be chained up for a year. On the other side of the Styx, Heracles entered the true underworld. The landscape was gray and misty, filled with the shades of the dead, ghostly forms that had once been living people. They moved aimlessly through the dim light, their substance so insubstantial that Heracles could pass his hand through them. The place was ruled by silence except for the occasional mournful wail. As Heracles walked through this land of the dead, he encountered various figures from his past. He saw the shade of Meleager, a hero who had died tragically, and Heracles promised to marry Meleager's sister Deianira when he returned to the living world, a promise that would have terrible consequences later. He saw the spirit of Medusa, the Gorgon he had heard so much about, and drew his sword, but Hermes told him there was nothing to fear. Medusa was only a shade now, powerless. Most poignantly, Heracles encountered Theseus and Perithous, two heroes who were trapped in the underworld. They had made the fatal mistake of trying to kidnap Persephone, the queen of the underworld and wife of Hades. As punishment, they had been fused to stone chairs, unable to move, condemned to sit there for eternity. When Heracles saw them, he tried to free Theseus, his old friend. He pulled with all his strength, and managed to tear Theseus loose from the chair, though the stone ripped away some of Theseus's flesh in the process, which is why, according to the myth, Theseus's descendants had notably thin thighs. But when Heracles tried to free Perithous as well, the earth itself began to shake. Hades' voice boomed through the underworld, forbidding it. Perithous had been the instigator of the plot to kidnap Persephone. He would remain imprisoned forever. Heracles had to leave his friend behind, a painful decision, but the only choice available. Finally, Heracles reached the palace of Hades himself, the dark throne room where the god of the dead held court. Hades sat on his throne with Persephone beside him, both regarding Heracles with cold interest. The hero explained his mission. He needed to take Cerberus to the surface world to show to Eurystheus. But he promised to return the hound unharmed when the task was complete. Hades considered this request. The king of the underworld had a certain respect for Heracles. After all, not many mortals had the courage to come here while still alive. After some deliberation, Hades agreed to allow Heracles to take Cerberus, but on one absolute condition: Heracles must subdue the hound using no weapons. He couldn't shoot Cerberus with arrows, couldn't hit him with his club, couldn't use his sword. He would have to overcome the guardian of the underworld with his bare hands alone. Heracles agreed and set out to find Cerberus. The great hound was at the gates of the underworld, where the river Acheron flowed. Cerberus saw Heracles approaching and knew immediately this was an intruder, a living being where only the dead should be. All three heads snarled, the serpent tail hissed, and the snakes along the dog's back rose up like a mane of living darkness. What followed was a wrestling match of titanic proportions. Heracles grabbed Cerberus around the middle body, trying to pin down all three heads at once. The hound was phenomenally strong, stronger than almost anything Heracles had faced. The three heads snapped at him from different angles, coming so close that he could feel their hot breath and smell the decay of death. The serpent tail lashed at him, trying to sink its fangs into his flesh. The snakes on the dog's back bit him repeatedly, though the Nemean lion's skin protected him from the worst of it. Heracles held on with all his divine strength, weathering the attacks, never losing his grip. Slowly, he tightened his hold, squeezing Cerberus in a powerful wrestling hold. The hound thrashed and struggled, but Heracles was stronger. Finally, sensing defeat, Cerberus yielded. The three heads stopped snapping and drooped in submission. The guardian of the underworld had been beaten. Heracles, breathing heavily but victorious, put a leash on Cerberus and began the long journey back to the surface. He retraced his steps through the underworld, past the shades of the dead, across the river Styx, and back up through the passages that led to the world of light and life. As he emerged into the sunlight at Taenarus, Cerberus howled in pain and fear. The hound of Hades had never seen daylight before. The sun hurt its eyes, and in some accounts, it thrashed so violently that its saliva flew everywhere, and wherever the drops fell, poisonous aconite, also called wolfsbane, began to grow, spreading throughout Greece. Heracles dragged the terrified, suffering Cerberus all the way to Tiryns. When he arrived at the palace and displayed the hound to Eurystheus, the king's reaction was more extreme than ever before. Seeing the actual guardian of the underworld, its three heads glaring at him, its serpent tail writhing, Eurystheus didn't just hide in his bronze jar. He reportedly begged Heracles to take the monster away immediately, and never bring it back. He wanted nothing more to do with these labors or with Heracles. The 12th labor was complete. Heracles had done the impossible. He had descended into the underworld and returned alive. He had faced death itself and mastered it. He had captured the uncapturable and brought back proof. And most importantly, Eurystheus acknowledged that all 12 labors were now finished. Heracles was finally free from his servitude. Heracles took Cerberus back to the underworld and returned the hound to Hades as promised. The guardian resumed its place at the gates of the dead, and order was restored. But Heracles was changed by the experience. He had been to the land of the dead, and seen what awaited mortals after life. He had walked in the realm of shades and shadows and then returned to the light. It was a journey that completed his transformation from mortal hero to something more, something ready to transcend death itself. The 12th labor represented the ultimate trial, the conquest of death. In facing Cerberus and descending to Hades, Heracles proved he was not bound by mortality in the same way other humans were. He could go to the land of the dead and return, something no one else had done. This final labor was the ultimate test of his readiness to become a god, to join his father Zeus on Mount Olympus and leave behind his mortal nature entirely. Psychologically, the descent into the underworld represents facing one's own mortality, confronting the ultimate fear that all humans share. By making this journey and returning, Heracles demonstrated mastery not just over external monsters but over the inner terror of death itself. He had conquered the final enemy, and in doing so, he was reborn as something greater. With the 12 labors complete, Heracles had proven himself beyond any doubt. He had traveled from the depths of the earth to the heights where Atlas held the sky. He had battled monsters, outwitted giants, navigated diplomatic challenges, and shown strength, intelligence, patience, and courage. He had been tested in every conceivable way, and he had never failed. The guilt that had driven him to begin this journey was being transformed into glory. The strength that had brought tragedy was being channeled into heroism. Heracles had become what the gods had intended him to be all along, the greatest hero Greece would ever know. But his story was not over. The labors were complete, but Heracles' life would continue with further adventures and ultimately, a final transformation that would take him beyond heroism into godhood itself. The journey that had begun in grief and madness would end in fire, apotheosis, and immortality among the stars. When the 12 labors were completed, Heracles was finally free from his obligation to Eurystheus. The oracle had promised that if he succeeded in this service, he would be purified of his guilt and granted immortality. But the path to that immortality would not be straightforward. Heracles had many more years of life ahead of him, filled with further adventures, loves, tragedies, and ultimately, a death that would transform him into a god. After his servitude ended, Heracles continued his heroic career. He joined Jason and the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece, though he didn't complete the entire journey. He participated in the Caledonian boar hunt alongside other great heroes of Greece. He fought in various wars, supported his friends, and challenged those who broke Xenia, the sacred laws of hospitality. He married Deianira, the sister of the hero Meleager, whose shade he had promised to honor in the underworld. But Heracles' great strength continued to bring both triumph and tragedy. He won archery contests, and then killed the king who refused to honor the prize. He served as a slave to Queen Omphale of Lydia for 3 years as punishment for one of his murders, and during this time, some sources say he wore women's clothing while Omphale wore his Nemean lion skin, a humbling reversal that taught him about gender and power. He fought various monsters and criminals, making the world safer but always at a cost. Throughout these years, Hera's hatred continued to plague him. The goddess would never forgive the reminder of Zeus's infidelity that Heracles represented. But Heracles, tempered by his labors and his experiences, had learned to endure. He had become wiser, more patient, capable of both tremendous violence and surprising gentleness. He was, in the fullest sense, a complete hero. The end came not from a monster or a god, but from love twisted by jealousy and misunderstanding. The instrument of his doom was created years earlier, during one of his adventures with Deianira. A centaur named Nessus had tried to rape Deianira while ferrying her across a river. Heracles, in fury, shot Nessus with one of his hydra poison arrows. As Nessus lay dying, he told Deianira a lie wrapped in apparent kindness. He said his blood, mixed with the hydra's poison, would act as a love potion. If she ever feared Heracles was falling in love with another woman, she should take a garment of his and soak it in this mixture. When Heracles wore the treated garment, he would love only her again. Deianira, believing the dying centaur's words, collected the blood and kept it for years. Eventually, she had reason to use it. Heracles had sacked the city of Oechalia and taken as a war prize a princess named Iole. Rumors reached Deianira that Heracles was in love with this young woman, that he might even replace Deianira with her. In her fear and jealousy, Deianira remembered Nessus's gift. She took one of Heracles' robes and soaked it in the blood and poison mixture, then sent it to her husband, believing it would restore his love for her. Heracles, having just completed a sacrifice to Zeus, put on the robe. Almost immediately, he felt an excruciating burning sensation. The Hydra's poison, activated by the heat of his body, began to eat through his skin, burning straight through to his bones. The poison was so potent that when Heracles tried to tear off the robe, his skin came off with it. The agony was beyond anything he had ever experienced. Worse than any wound from any monster. Worse than holding up the sky. Worse than anything imaginable. In his torment, Heracles threw Lycus, the servant who had brought him the robe, into the sea to his death. He raged and screamed, his superhuman body finally betrayed by something it couldn't fight, poison working from the inside, destroying him cell by cell. When news reached Deianira of what she had accidentally done, she was devastated. The love potion was actually a death sentence. Unable to live with the knowledge that she had killed her husband, Deianira hanged herself. Heracles, knowing he was dying and that the poison would not allow him to die quickly or easily, made a choice. If death was inevitable, he would meet it on his own terms. He ordered his companions to build a massive funeral pyre on Mount Oeta. When the pyre was ready, Heracles climbed onto it, laid himself down on his Nemean lion's skin, and used his club as a pillow. He then commanded that the pyre be lit. No one wanted to light the pyre and be responsible for the death of the greatest hero Greece had ever known. Finally, a young man named Philoctetes agreed to do it. As a reward for this service, Heracles gave Philoctetes his legendary bow and poisoned arrows, weapons that would later prove crucial in the Trojan War. As the flames rose around him, consuming his mortal body, something remarkable happened. The fire burned away everything mortal about Heracles, the flesh that had been born from Alcmene, the human weaknesses, the capacity to die. But the divine spark from Zeus, the god-born essence of his being, was untouched by the flames. When the pyre had burned down and Heracles' companions came to collect the bones for burial, they found nothing. The mortal Heracles was gone completely. At the moment the flames had consumed his mortal body, Zeus himself had intervened. Thunder rolled across the sky, and a bolt of lightning struck the pyre. Heracles awoke to find himself not in death, but on Mount Olympus, in the presence of the gods. He had undergone apotheosis, the transformation from mortal to divine. The prophecy of the oracle had come true. Through his suffering, through his labors and his trials, he had earned what he had been promised, immortality. The gods welcomed Heracles into their company. Zeus formally adopted him as a god, granting him all the privileges and powers of divinity. And in perhaps the most remarkable turn of all, Hera finally reconciled with Heracles. The goddess whose hatred had driven his entire mortal life, who had sent the madness that killed his family and instigated the labors that defined him, now accepted him as part of the divine order. She even gave him her daughter Hebe, the goddess of youth, as his divine wife. Hera's hatred, it seemed, had been burned away along with Heracles' mortality. Heracles took his place among the Olympian gods, no longer half man and half god, but fully divine. He became the guardian of the gates of Olympus, using the same strength that had captured Cerberus to protect the realm of the gods. He became a symbol of the possibility of transcendence, proof that mortals could achieve immortality through virtue, courage, and perseverance. But there was a complexity to Heracles' new existence. In Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus visits the underworld, he encounters what seems to be two versions of Heracles simultaneously. A shade of Heracles is among the dead, still armed with his bow and club, while he himself feasts with the immortals on Olympus. Different ancient scholars interpreted this differently, Some saw it as proof that part of Heracles remained mortal while part became divine, a permanent duality reflecting his dual nature. Others argued that the shade was simply a phantom, a memory of what Heracles had been, while the real Heracles existed fully on Olympus. This ambiguity actually made Heracles more powerful as a religious figure in ancient Greece. He could be worshipped both as a hero, with tomb cults and funeral rites, and as a god, with sacrifices and temples. Different cities emphasized different aspects of his nature. In Athens and many other places, he was honored as a full god. In Thebes, his birthplace, he was also honored as a hero with appropriate rituals at his tomb. When we look at the complete story of Heracles, from his tragic murder of his family through his labors to his eventual apotheosis, we're seeing more than just a series of adventures. We're witnessing a profound psychological and spiritual journey, one that has resonated with people for over 2 millennia because it speaks to fundamental aspects of the human experience. Heracles' story fits remarkably well into what Joseph Campbell called the monomyth, or the hero's journey, a pattern of narrative that Campbell argued was universal across human cultures. The journey typically involves a hero in his ordinary world, called to adventure, refusing that call initially, meeting mentors, crossing into a special world, facing tests and allies, approaching the innermost cave, experiencing an ordeal, achieving a reward, taking the road back, experiencing resurrection, and finally returning with the elixir that benefits society. Heracles follows this pattern with some variations. His ordinary world was his life with Megara and his children, a domestic existence that was shattered by Hera's curse. The call to adventure came through the oracle, who commanded him to serve Eurystheus. His refusal manifested in his initial despair and desire to die. His mentors included Chiron, Athena, and even, ironically, the very monsters he fought, each teaching him something new. The labors themselves represent the series of tests in the special world. Each labor taught him something different. The Nemean lion taught him about adapting tactics, the Hydra about asking for help, the Ceryneian hind about patience, the Augean stables about using intelligence over force, the Stymphalian birds about accepting divine aid, and so on. The descent to capture Cerberus was his journey to the innermost cave, literally the realm of death itself. His resurrection came through the funeral pyre, where his mortal nature was burned away and his divine nature emerged. And his return with the elixir was not a return to ordinary life but an elevation to godhood, where he could serve as an example and protector for humanity from his position on Olympus. At its heart, Heracles' story is about redemption. He begins as a man who has committed the ultimate crime, killing his own innocent children and wife. The guilt from this act would destroy most people, and indeed, Heracles initially wanted to die. But the oracle offered him a path. Suffer through these impossible tasks, prove your worth, and you will be cleansed. This is a profoundly psychological concept. Heracles couldn't simply be forgiven. He had to transform himself through ordeal. Each labor stripped away another layer of his old self, the self that had been capable of violence against those he loved. Through facing monsters external, he was confronting and mastering the monster internal, the rage, the lack of control, the deadly combination of divine power and human emotion. The labors were not punishment in the modern sense, but rather purgation, a purifying process that burned away the impurities of his character and left only the heroic essence. By the time he completed all 12 labors, Heracles was fundamentally different from the man who had started them. He had learned patience, wisdom, humility, the value of intelligence over brute force, the importance of respecting the gods, and the strength that comes from perseverance. Psychologist Carl Jung, who drew heavily on mythology in his work, would likely have seen Heracles as representing the process of individuation, the integration of opposite aspects of the personality into a whole. Heracles embodied many oppositions: mortal and divine, human and superhuman, civilized and wild, destroyer and protector, victim and victor, weak and strong, mad and sane. Throughout his life, these opposites were in conflict, creating the tensions that drove his story. His divine strength led to mortal tragedies. His human emotions conflicted with superhuman expectations. His role as protector was always shadowed by his potential as destroyer. The 12 labors can be seen as a process of reconciling these opposites, of learning to balance these conflicting aspects of his nature. By the time he completed them, Heracles had integrated these oppositions. He could be both strong and gentle, both fierce and patient, both mortal and understanding and divine in capability. The apotheosis, his transformation into a full god, represented the final integration, the resolution of the central conflict of his existence. Heracles has often been read as representing a particular form of masculinity, the strong warrior, the protector, the hero who solves problems through might. But his story actually presents a much more nuanced view of masculine identity. Yes, Heracles was phenomenally strong, but his story repeatedly shows that strength alone is insufficient. He needed intelligence, patience, the wisdom to accept help, the humility to serve others, the emotional capacity to mourn, and the self-control to show mercy and restraint. His interactions with powerful women, Hera, Athena, Hippolyta, Omphale, Deianira, complicated the simple strongman narrative. These women held power over him in various ways, and he had to learn to navigate these relationships, not through force but through negotiation, respect, or acceptance. In Jungian psychology, the shadow represents the parts of ourselves that we don't want to acknowledge, our capacity for violence, our base desires, our destructive potential. Heracles' story is, in many ways, about confronting and integrating the shadow. The monsters he fought can be seen as externalized shadows, physical manifestations of various dark aspects of human nature. The Nemean lion, invulnerable rage. The Hydra, problems that multiply when attacked directly. The Stymphalian birds, intrusive, destructive thoughts. Cerberus, the fear of death. By defeating these external shadows, Heracles was learning to confront and master the corresponding aspects within himself. The madness sent by Hera that caused him to kill his family was the ultimate manifestation of his shadow, the destructive potential of his strength when it wasn't properly controlled. The entire journey of the labors was about bringing that shadow under conscious control, integrating it into his personality in a way that made him whole rather than dangerous. The final element of Heracles' psychological journey was his relationship with death. He died multiple symbolic deaths throughout his story. The death of his family marked the end of his ordinary life. The descent to capture Cerberus was a symbolic death and return. And finally, his actual death on the funeral pyre was the ultimate transformation. But each death led to a rebirth. After killing his family, he was reborn as a hero undertaking the labors. After returning from Hades, he was reborn as someone who had mastered death. After the funeral pyre, he was literally reborn as a god. This cycle of death and rebirth is central to many psychological models of transformation. To become something new, something better, we must allow parts of our old self to die. We must go through a period of crisis, dissolution, and reconstruction. Heracles' story shows this process in mythic form. Each ordeal killed something in him that needed to die, allowing something better to be born. Why does Heracles' story still resonate today, thousands of years after it was first told? Perhaps because the fundamental challenges he faced are still relevant. We all struggle with guilt, with the feeling that we've done irreparable harm. We all face tasks that seem impossible, challenges that test us to our limits. We all have to learn when to use force and when to use intelligence, when to persevere and when to ask for help. We all struggle with the darker aspects of our nature, with the capacity for harm that exists in everyone. We all must confront our mortality and find meaning in the face of death. And we all hope, in some way, to transcend our limitations, to become something more than we are. Heracles' journey from grief-stricken murderer to immortal god shows that transformation is possible, that redemption can be earned, that strength can be channeled toward good, and that our mistakes, no matter how terrible, don't have to define us forever. In an age of therapy and self-help, Heracles' 12 labors can be seen as the original course of psychological transformation, a brutal, demanding, but ultimately successful process of becoming whole. Heracles stands at the center of Greek mythology as its most human god and its most divine hero. His story has been told and retold countless times, adapted into plays, operas, novels, movies, and television shows. The ancient Greeks worshipped him at hundreds of temples and shrines across their world. The Romans adopted him enthusiastically as Hercules, seeing in him a model of virtus, manly courage, and excellence. His image appeared on coins, in sculptures, in paintings, decorating everything from temples to drinking cups. In art throughout history, Heracles has been depicted at every stage of his journey. We see him as a baby strangling snakes, as a muscular hero wearing the Nemean lion's skin and carrying his club, as a suffering figure straining under the weight of the heavens, as an anguished man on his funeral pyre, and as a glorified god welcomed into Olympus. Writers and thinkers from Sophocles and Euripides to Shakespeare and beyond have used Heracles as a symbol. The word, Herculean, has entered our language as a synonym for anything requiring enormous effort. The Pillars of Hercules, which he supposedly erected at the Strait of Gibraltar, marked the western edge of the known world, beyond which lay only mystery and danger. His constellation, placed in the stars by the gods, still looks down on us each night. But beyond all the cultural impact, beyond the temples and the artwork and the stories, what makes Heracles truly eternal is the psychological truth at the heart of his myth. He represents our potential for transformation, our capacity to overcome our worst mistakes through dedicated effort and perseverance. He shows us that strength without wisdom is dangerous, that intelligence without humility is worthless, that power without compassion is monstrous. He demonstrates that true heroism isn't about being perfect or invulnerable, but about facing our flaws, acknowledging our failures, and working tirelessly to become better. The labors weren't just tasks to be completed, they were opportunities for growth, lessons to be learned, stages in a journey of self-transformation that took Heracles from a tragic figure consumed by guilt to an immortal god worthy of worship. In the end, Heracles teaches us that the hardest battles we fight are often the ones within ourselves. The most dangerous monsters are sometimes the ones we carry in our hearts. The longest journey is the one from who we are to who we could become. And the most important strength is not the ability to overpower our enemies, but the courage to face our own shadows and emerge transformed. As you drift off to sleep, imagine Heracles taking his place among the stars, his labors complete, his mortal suffering ended, his transformation fulfilled. Imagine the hero who faced every impossible challenge and succeeded, who descended into death itself and returned, who earned through effort what others received by birthright. Imagine the strength not just of muscle, but of will, of mind, of heart. The story of Heracles reminds us that we all have the potential for greatness within us, that we all can overcome our past mistakes, that redemption is always possible through dedication and perseverance. His journey from mortal tragedy to divine triumph is, in its way, the journey we all hope to make, from limitation to transcendence, from suffering to peace, from mortality to something greater. And with that thought, let your breathing slow, let your body relax, and allow yourself to rest, knowing that the challenges you face, no matter how impossible they seem, can be overcome with strength, wisdom, courage, and perseverance. Like Heracles, may you find the hero within yourself, ready to face any labor, ready to complete any trial, ready to begin the journey toward your own transformation. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the mythology of Heracles, the greatest of all Greek heroes, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the Mythos Deep Dive. We journey through the ancient world every week, exploring the stories that have shaped human culture for millennia, uncovering the psychological truths hidden in myth, and bringing these timeless tales to life with the detail and respect they deserve. Until next time, may your own labors bring you wisdom, and may your journey lead you toward your own apotheosis.